Let's take a deep breath, relax, and slowly explore the story of wine. Somewhere in the mountains of the South Caucasus, roughly 8,000 years ago, a farmer lifted a clay jar to their lips and tasted something that had never existed before. The grape juice they had stored a few days earlier had changed. It was warmer on the tongue, slightly fizzy, and it carried a sensation unlike anything they had ever known. A gentle loosening of the body, a warmth spreading outward from the chest, a quiet softening of the edges of the world. They could not have understood what had happened inside that jar. They could not have known that tiny living things on the surface of the grape skins had been feeding on the sugar in the juice, slowly turning it into something new. All they knew was that this liquid was different from anything else, and that they wanted more of it. That moment, or something very much like it, is how the story of wine begins. And it is worth pausing on the fact that wine was not invented. Nobody set out to create it. It was discovered, born from an accident, a coming together of fruit and vessel and warmth and time that required no recipe and no intention at all. The wild grapevine had been growing across the forests and riverbanks of Western Asia for millions of years before any person ever tasted its fruit. The grapes were small, tart, and thick-skinned, scattered in loose clusters across the canopy of the trees they climbed toward the sun. Birds ate them and carried the seeds far and wide, and the vines spread quietly across a vast stretch of land from what is now Spain all the way to the foothills of the Himalayas. The turning point was not the grape itself. People had been eating wild grapes for tens of thousands of years. The turning point was what happened when someone crushed those grapes, collected the juice, and left it sitting in a container. In the warmth of the Caucasus summer, the tiny organisms on the grape skins went to work almost immediately. Within hours, the juice began to bubble. Within days, it had changed into something altogether different, something that loosened the mind and warmed the belly and made the world feel, for a little while, a bit softer and more generous than it usually did. Now, the proof for all of this comes not from stories or legends, but from the earth itself. In 2017, a team of scientists working at two ancient settlements in the country of Georgia, about 50 kilometers south of the modern city of Tbilisi, made a remarkable discovery. They analyzed pottery fragments that had been pieced back together into large jars, and using careful chemical tests, they found traces of the very same acids that are the fingerprint of grape wine. These jars were roughly 8,000 years old, dating to around 6,000 years before the Common Era. That made them the oldest confirmed evidence of winemaking anywhere in the world. Can you picture that for a moment? A small farming village in the green hills of Georgia, clay houses with low roofs, animals moving slowly in the morning light, and somewhere in that settlement, large jars filled with grape juice slowly turning into wine. The people who lived in these villages were not just stumbling onto fermentation by chance. Their pottery was decorated with patterns that looked like grape clusters, and the soil around their homes was thick with grapevine pollen, which tells us they had already developed a special relationship with this plant. They recognized something important about the grape, and they celebrated it in the objects they made with their hands. Before these discoveries in Georgia, the title of oldest known wine had belonged to a site in the mountains of northern Iran called Haji Firouz, where jars from around 5,000 years before the Common Era held traces of grape wine mixed with tree resin. That was a landmark finding in its own time. But the Georgian jars pushed the story back by at least another 600 years, placing the very beginning of winemaking in a period when people were only just learning to settle down, plant crops, and build permanent homes. And this is a lovely detail worth holding on to. Wine did not arrive late to the human story. It was there from the very start, part of the same great shift that gave us farming and villages and bread and pottery. The same communities that were learning to grow wheat and tend sheep were also learning to manage grapevines and turn their juice into something that altered the way the world felt. Why did they bother? The simplest answer is that wine was a way of preserving the grape harvest. Fresh juice spoils quickly, but fermented juice, wine, can last for months or even years in a sealed clay jar. That made it practical, a way of storing calories and flavor for the lean times between harvests. But preservation alone does not explain the reverence that wine so quickly inspired. The truth is that wine did something no other food could do. It changed how people felt. It eased pain, loosened tongues, brought warmth on cold nights, and created a shared sense of well-being that bound people closer together. In a world without writing, without formal religion, without any of the big systems that would later organize human life, wine offered a repeatable, reliable experience of something beyond the ordinary. And that made it, for the people who first discovered it, something close to sacred. The wine they drank was nothing like what we know today. It was probably cloudy and unstable, quick to go sour, flavored by whatever wild organisms happened to be living on the grape skins. It may have been sweetened with honey or mixed with herbs. It was almost certainly drunk young within weeks of being made. But it was wine, and the people who made it understood that they had found something worth keeping, something worth carrying with them as they moved out into the wider world. And carry it they did in their clay jars, along with their vine cuttings and their knowledge, outward from the Caucasus Mountains to every corner of the ancient world. That journey from a clay jar in the hills of Georgia to the wine glass on your table tonight is the story we are going to follow together. And it is a journey that stretches across 8,000 years of human history, touching every civilization, every continent, and every corner of the human experience. So settle in and let us begin at the very beginning. In a small village in the hills of southeastern Georgia, a family gathers around a freshly dug pit in their courtyard. A large egg-shaped clay vessel, taller than a man and wide enough to hold several hundred liters of liquid, is carefully lowered into the earth. Once buried, only the mouth of the jar remains visible at ground level. The family will fill it with crushed grapes, juice, and skins and stems all together, and seal the opening with a flat stone and beeswax. For the next 5 or 6 months, the wine will ferment and age underground, kept at a steady temperature by the surrounding earth, untouched by human hands. When the seal is finally broken, they will drink wine that tastes of their soil, their weather, their own particular corner of the world. This tradition, known as the Cuivre method, has been practiced in Georgia for roughly 8,000 years. In 2013, it was recognized by UNESCO as one of the oldest continuously practiced winemaking traditions on Earth. The Cuivre itself is a handmade earthenware vessel shaped like a giant egg, fired at high temperatures and lined inside with beeswax. It serves as fermenter, aging vessel, and storage container all in one. Unlike the oak barrels and steel tanks that would come to dominate winemaking in later centuries, the Cuivre adds nothing of its own flavor to the wine. It simply holds it, quietly and patiently, underground. Georgia's claim as the birthplace of wine rests on both the science we talked about a moment ago and something harder to measure, which is the sheer depth of the country's wine culture. Georgia is home to more than 500 grape varieties found nowhere else on Earth, an extraordinary concentration of diversity that speaks to thousands of years of careful cultivation. Wine in Georgia is not simply a drink or an industry. It is woven into the fabric of daily life, into the feasts called supras, where a toastmaster leads the table through elaborate rounds of toasting, each glass of wine carrying words of gratitude, remembrance, or hope. In the Kakheti region of eastern Georgia, nearly every family makes wine at home using methods that have changed remarkably little across the millennia. The wines produced in the Georgian tradition are unlike anything most of us have tasted. The most distinctive style is amber wine, made by fermenting white grape juice in long contact with its skins and seeds, a process that gives the wine a deep golden or amber color, a slightly grippy texture, and rich flavors of dried fruit and honey. While most white wines around the world are made by separating juice from skins before fermentation begins, the Georgian method treats white grapes much the way red grapes are treated elsewhere. This approach, which has inspired a whole movement of winemakers around the world in recent years, is simply the way wine has always been made in this part of the world. Now, let us travel about 500 kilometers to the south, to the mountains of Armenia, where another piece of the wine story was waiting to be found. In 2007, in a cave complex near the village of Arani in southern Armenia, a team of archaeologists uncovered what turned out to be the oldest known winery in the world. Not just traces of wine in a jar, but an entire production facility, dating to roughly 4,100 years before the Common Era. Inside the cool, dark chambers of the cave, the team found a shallow clay basin that had been used as a grape press, a large storage vat sunk into the floor, several smaller jars, and even a drinking cup and bowl. The evidence told a clear story. Grapes had been crushed by foot in the basin. The juice had flowed down into the vat below to ferment, and the finished wine had been poured into jars for storage or drinking. Scattered around the press were the remains of the grapes themselves, dried seeds, withered vine fragments, and the compressed leftover pulp that winemakers call pomace. Chemical tests confirmed the presence of a pigment found in red grape skins, and the grape remains were identified as a domesticated variety, not wild. This was not an accidental fermentation. This was organized, intentional winemaking, carried out by people who had been cultivating grapes and making wine for a very long time. The cave itself was a clever choice for a winery. Its natural temperature was cool and constant year-round, making it an ideal place for fermentation and storage, a natural cellar thousands of years before anyone built an actual cellar. The cave also contained numerous burials, which suggests that the winemaking there may have had a sacred or ceremonial purpose. Wine and death, wine and the divine, wine and the crossing between worlds. These associations appear here in this Armenian cave, and they would echo through every civilization that followed. There is a gentle rivalry between Georgia and Armenia over the title of birthplace of wine, and it is, at heart, a rivalry born of deep love for this ancient drink. Georgia points to the chemical evidence of wine in jars dating to 6,000 years before the Common Era, nearly 2,000 years older than the Armenian winery. Armenia points out that Arani is not just residue in a pot, but a complete production facility, with a press and a vat and cups for drinking, evidence of a more advanced stage of wine culture. Both claims have real merit, and both countries hold wine at the center of their national identity in ways that go far beyond what we might think of as a mere industry. What the evidence from this region reveals, taken together, is that winemaking did not begin with a single flash of inspiration in a single place. It emerged slowly, across a broad region over thousands of years. The wild grapevines of the South Caucasus provided the raw material. The clay soils provided the pottery. The warm days and cool nights provided the ideal conditions for fermentation. And the people of this region provided the curiosity, the patience, and the desire to turn a fragile, perishable fruit into something lasting, something that changed how they felt and brought them closer together around a shared table. From these mountain valleys, the vine and its liquid gift would begin a long, slow journey outward, carried by traders and travelers, by migrants and missionaries across deserts and seas, until it reached every corner of the inhabited world. And one of the first places it reached was a land of pharaohs and pyramids, along the banks of a great river far to the south. Around the year 3150 before the Common Era, a ruler known to history as Scorpion I was laid to rest in a grand tomb at the ancient burial ground of Abydos in Upper Egypt. He was buried with the provisions that rulers expected to carry into the afterlife, food and tools and ornaments, and, crucially, wine. Not just a jar or two, but roughly 700 vessels of it, stacked 3 rooms high, enough to supply a lavish feast that was meant to last forever. The jars had been made from clay found in the distant Jordan Valley, and the wine inside them had been carried hundreds of miles overland by donkey and then by boat up the Nile. The effort involved in filling this single tomb with wine tells us that even at the dawn of Egyptian civilization, wine was a substance of extraordinary value, precious enough to justify a journey across deserts and rivers. When scientists examined the residue inside those jars, they found something unexpected. The wine was not plain grape wine. It had been mixed with herbs and tree resin, the earliest known example of what we might call herbal wine. Whether the additions were meant as medicine, as part of a ceremony, or simply as flavoring, we cannot be sure. But their presence tells us that from the very beginning of wine in Egypt, this was not a simple drink. It was a carefully prepared creation, reflecting the knowledge and intentions of the people who made it. Now, Egypt was not, strictly speaking, a natural home for grapevines. The vast majority of the country was desert, and the Nile Valley, while wonderfully fertile, was humid and low-lying, conditions that could encourage the diseases that grapevines are most vulnerable to. Yet, the Egyptians proved remarkably skilled at growing grapes. They concentrated their vineyards in the western part of the Nile Delta, where conditions were a little cooler and drier, and in oases scattered across the western desert. And they left us, preserved in the dry Egyptian air, one of the most beautiful visual records of ancient winemaking anywhere in the world. In tomb after tomb, painted scenes show the entire process with vivid clarity. Workers pick grapes from trellised vines. Men stand in large stone basins, treading the grapes with their bare feet, holding onto overhead ropes for balance as the juice runs out through a spout into a collecting vessel below. In some paintings, workers are shown squeezing the last drops of juice from the leftover grape pulp by twisting it inside a large cloth, using poles at each end for leverage. These scenes are thousands of years old, and yet they are so detailed and lifelike that you can almost hear the splashing of the juice and the chatter of the workers. Can you picture that scene for a moment? The warm Egyptian sunlight, the smell of crushed grapes, the laughter of the workers as they balance on the overhead ropes, the steady trickle of purple juice into the waiting jars below. During the period known as the New Kingdom, from roughly 1550 to 1070 before the Common Era, Egyptian wine culture reached a level of sophistication that is genuinely worth pausing on. The Egyptians developed what may fairly be called the world's first wine labeling system. Their storage jars were marked with a simplified form of their writing that recorded the year the wine was made, counted by the ruling year of the pharaoh, the place the wine came from, a quality rating, and sometimes even the name of the head winemaker. A typical label might have read something like Year 4, wine of very good quality, from the estate of the Western River, chief winemaker, so-and-so. The quality ratings used a simple but effective system, a single word for good, the same word repeated for very good, and repeated again for very, very good, a kind of ancient star rating. The most famous example of this labeling system was found in the tomb of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, who died around 1322 before the Common Era. When the tomb was opened in 1922, 36 wine jars were found in a side room, each carefully labeled with its origin and vintage year. The wines came from several different estates and spanned multiple years, and later scientific analysis revealed a detail that surprised everyone. While most of the wines were red, at least one jar contained traces of white wine, the first confirmed evidence of white wine production in ancient Egypt. The fact that Tutankhamun's wines came from named estates and specific years tells us something rather remarkable. The Egyptians had already grasped the idea of vintage variation, the understanding that wines made in different years could differ greatly in quality depending on the weather. This concept, which would not be formally written down in Europe for another 3,000 years, was already being practiced in the Nile Delta in the 14th century before the Common Era. Wine in ancient Egypt was firmly a drink of the elite. While beer was the everyday beverage of workers and farmers, brewed from barley and consumed in enormous quantities, wine was reserved for the pharaoh, the royal court, the priests, and the highest officials. The workers who built the Great Pyramid were given daily rations of bread and beer, but never wine. Wine appeared at royal banquets, at religious festivals, and above all as an offering to the gods. The god Osiris, who presided over all things that grew and died and were reborn, was closely linked to wine, a fitting connection given the annual cycle of the vine. Temple records document vast quantities of wine offered to the gods, drunk by priests, and shared during festivals. The Egyptian contribution to the story of wine is often overlooked in favor of the Greeks and Romans, but it was quietly profound. The Egyptians established wine as a marker of wealth and status, as a sacred offering, as a form of medicine, and as an object worthy of careful record-keeping and connoisseurship. They created labeling practices that anticipated modern wine classification by thousands of years. And they ensured that wine was one of the things a pharaoh would carry into the afterlife, a liquid bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. And so the vine continued its journey, moving now beyond the Nile, out into the wider ancient world, carried by the most daring sailors of the ancient Mediterranean. In the ancient city of Uruk, around 2700 years before the Common Era, a scribe pressed a sharpened reed into a tablet of wet clay and wrote down the story of a king named Gilgamesh. It is the oldest epic poem we know of, and in it, the hero Gilgamesh travels to the edge of the world searching for the secret of eternal life. Along the way, he meets one of the most intriguing figures in all of ancient literature, a goddess named Sidori, who keeps a tavern at the boundary between the known world and the unknown. Sidori offers Gilgamesh wine and counsel, urging him to stop chasing immortality and instead embrace the simple pleasures of being alive, to eat well, to drink, to dance, to hold his loved ones close. It is one of the earliest moments in literature where wine appears not just as a drink, but as a companion to wisdom, a medium for thinking about what it means to be human. Wine held a special place in the civilizations of the ancient Near East. In Mesopotamia, beer was the common everyday drink, brewed from barley and shared by everyone, rich and poor alike. Wine was different, because grapes did not grow well in the flat, hot lowlands of southern Mesopotamia. Wine had to be brought in from the cooler, hillier regions to the north and east. That made it rare and expensive, a drink for kings and priests and the wealthy. In the records of Mesopotamian palaces, wine is listed alongside precious metals, rare stones, and fine cloth, a luxury import carefully counted and closely guarded. The people of the Levant, the coastal lands of what is now Lebanon, Israel, and western Syria, were among the first to turn winemaking into a real business. The hillsides of the region, with their mild winters and warm summers, were well suited to growing grapes, and evidence from ancient sites shows that these people had developed impressive winemaking equipment, including large treading floors, settling basins, and storage facilities. They were among the first to trade wine with Egypt, establishing business relationships that lasted for centuries. But it was the Phoenicians, the great seafaring traders who came after them, who would change the story of wine more than perhaps any other people of the ancient world. The Phoenicians were based in the port cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos along the coast of modern-day Lebanon, and between roughly 1550 and 300 years before the Common Era, they built a trading network that stretched across the entire Mediterranean Sea. Their ships, powered by oar and sail, carried cargoes of purple dye, cedarwood, glass, metalwork, and most importantly for our story, wine and vine cuttings. Here is a detail that is quietly remarkable. As the Phoenicians established colonies and trading posts around the Mediterranean, they did not merely sell wine. They carried grapevine cuttings with them and planted vineyards at every new settlement. This means that the Phoenicians were not just merchants of wine, They were distributors of the vine itself, carrying the plant from its homeland in the eastern Mediterranean and planting it in places where it had never grown before. Their colony at Carthage in what is now Tunisia was founded around 814 before the Common Era and received vine cuttings that would form the basis of North African winemaking for centuries to come. Other settlements on Sicily, Sardinia, the islands between Spain and France, and the coast of the Iberian Peninsula all received Phoenician vines, establishing grape growing in region after region where it had never existed. The scale of this wine trade is written in the soil of the Mediterranean. Phoenician storage jars, the distinctive two-handled vessels used for carrying liquids by ship, have been found at archaeological sites from the coast of Portugal to the islands of the Aegean Sea. Each one held roughly 20 to 30 liters of wine, and they were the shipping containers of their day, standardized vessels that made long-distance trade in wine possible across thousands of miles of open water. And the Phoenicians did something else that mattered enormously. They did not just sell wine to the peoples they traded with, they taught them how to make it. The people of the Iberian Peninsula, of North Africa, of Sicily, and of Sardinia learned the art of growing grapes and making wine from Phoenician settlers, adapting the imported grape varieties to their own local conditions and developing their own traditions over time. Studies of ancient grape seeds from archaeological sites across the Western Mediterranean have confirmed that many grape varieties still grown in Spain, Portugal, and North Africa today trace their roots back to the vines the Phoenicians brought with them thousands of years ago. The city of Tyre, the greatest of the Phoenician city-states, was legendary for its wealth and sophistication. Built on a small island off the Lebanese coast, it was nearly impossible to attack by land and commanded the sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. The wine that flowed through its harbors connected the vineyards of the Levant to the markets of Egypt, Greece, and beyond. Ancient texts mention the wine of Tyre again and again, and the prophet Ezekiel described the city's vast trading network in vivid detail, listing wine among the goods that made Tyre fabulously rich. The Phoenician wine trade also helped establish one of the great cultural patterns of the ancient world, the idea that wine was a mark of civilization itself. For the Phoenicians, as for the Greeks who would follow them, people who drank wine were considered civilized. People who did not were regarded with curiosity or condescension. This belief, which would persist for a very long time and shape how European cultures thought about the rest of the world, had its beginnings in the trading ports of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, where wine served as both a product to sell and a badge of belonging. By the time Phoenician civilization faded in the face of Greek and then Roman expansion, the grapevine had been planted across nearly the entire Mediterranean coastline. The Phoenicians had accomplished something extraordinary. They had taken a plant that was first grown in the mountains of the Caucasus and spread it across a maritime network stretching thousands of miles, creating the foundation for wine cultures that would flourish for the next 3,000 years. And it was the Greeks who would build on that foundation next, bringing to wine something the Phoenicians had not, a god of their own to preside over every glass. On a warm evening in Athens, around the 5th century before the Common Era, a group of well-born men recline on cushioned couches arranged around the walls of a painted room in a wealthy citizen's home. In the center of the floor stands a large, beautifully decorated ceramic bowl filled with a carefully measured mixture of wine and water. A servant dips a long-handled ladle into the bowl and fills shallow drinking cups, passing one to each guest. The host has determined tonight's ratio, 3 parts water to 1 part wine, and the men will drink together, discuss philosophy and politics, listen to poetry and music, and gradually ease into a state of cheerful conversation that the Greeks considered not just acceptable, but something close to sacred. This is the symposium, the Greek drinking party, and it is one of the most important social gatherings in the ancient world. For the ancient Greeks, wine was not simply a beverage. It was inseparable from civilization itself. They drank it at every meal. poured it on the ground as an offering to the gods, used it as medicine, traded it across the sea, and wove it so deeply into their stories that the god of wine, Dionysus, was counted among the 12 greatest gods on Mount Olympus. The poet Homer described the sea itself as wine dark, a phrase that has puzzled translators for centuries. And Hesiod, the farmer poet of the 8th century before the Common Era, included careful instructions for growing grapes and making wine in his guide to the agricultural year, the earliest farming manual in Western literature. Dionysus was among the most complex figures in all of Greek religion. He was the god of wine, of fertility, of wildness, of religious ecstasy, and of the theatre. That combination tells us a great deal about how the Greeks understood wine. It could bring joy and closeness, but it could also bring madness and ruin. Dionysus held both possibilities in his hands. His worship, which may have begun as early as 1500 years before the Common Era, involved ecstatic ceremonies in which participants, often women known as maenads, drank deeply, danced wildly, and entered trance-like states that were believed to be a form of divine possession. Wine, in the Greek view, opened a door between the human world and the world of the gods, and Dionysus was the one who stood on the threshold. The festivals held in his honor were not small affairs. The great theatrical celebrations of Athens, the city Dionysia and the Lenaea, were held as offerings to Dionysus, and the plays of the great Greek dramatists were all first performed at these festivals. Greek tragedy and comedy were, in a very real sense, children of wine. The experience of sitting in a vast open-air theatre, watching stories of gods and heroes unfold while sharing in wine, was understood as something Dionysian, an experience that dissolved the boundaries between performer and audience, between the everyday and the divine. Greek winemaking was a skilled craft that reflected the remarkable variety of the Greek world. The mainland, the southern peninsula, and the many islands of the Aegean each developed their own styles. The island of Thasos was famous for its dark, rich wines. The island of Chios produced wines so prized that counterfeiting was a serious problem, forcing the authorities to stamp official seals on storage jars to guarantee their origins. Other islands like Lesbos, Crete, and Rhodes all had wines of recognized quality, and the warm sunshine and cooling sea breezes of the Aegean made it possible to grow grapes of intense flavor and natural sweetness. The Greeks made their wines in ways that might seem unusual to us today. The most distinctive style was wine flavored with pine resin, a practice that began as a practical measure. Pine resin was used to seal the mouths of storage jars and coat their insides, preventing the wine from going bad during storage and shipping. Over time, the people grew to enjoy the resin flavor itself, and winemakers began adding it deliberately. Beyond that, Greeks also added honey, herbs, spices, and even seawater to their wines, creating a whole range of flavored drinks that were quite different from the single grape wines we prize today. Perhaps the most lasting Greek contribution to wine culture was the development of trade networks that connected the Greek world to distant lands. Even the earliest Greek civilization, the Mycenaeans, were shipping wine in large jars to Cyprus, Egypt, and southern Italy as early as the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. By the height of the classical period, wine had become one of Greece's most important exports. Millions of jar fragments bearing the stamped seals of Greek cities and islands have been found by archaeologists all around the Mediterranean, creating a detailed map of ancient trade. The symposium was the social setting where wine's role was most fully expressed. Unlike a modern dinner party, it was an exclusively male gathering, held in a private room of the host's home. Guests reclined on couches, and the evening was organized around structured drinking, conversation, and entertainment. The host decided the ratio of water to wine, and drinking outside the rules of the evening was considered a serious breach of manners. The importance of mixing wine with water cannot be overstated. For the Greeks, drinking wine without adding water was a mark of barbarism, the behavior of wild peoples from the north whom the Greeks regarded as uncivilized. This custom had practical roots as well, since Greek wines were often very strong, and diluting them made it possible to drink and talk for hours without losing your wits too quickly. The philosophers, too, gave wine a central place in their thinking. One of the most famous works of Western philosophy, written by Plato, is set at a symposium where the great thinker Socrates and his friends discuss the nature of love over cups of diluted wine. The dialogue captures the ideal of the drinking party as a place where loosened tongues might lead to deeper truth. Wine, in the Greek philosophical tradition, was not an obstacle to thought, but a gentle companion to it. And it is from this rich, wine-soaked culture that the story now passes to the civilization that would do more than any other to spread the vine across the ancient world. The Romans, who would take the Greek love of wine and expand it to the scale of an empire. In the year 121 before the Common Era, the Roman consul Lucius Opimius oversaw a grape harvest that would become the most celebrated vintage in ancient history. The summer had been unusually warm and dry, the grapes had ripened to extraordinary sweetness, and the wines produced that year, particularly those from the volcanic slopes of Mount Phylloxera in the Campania region, were of a quality that Romans would speak of for generations. 61 years later, a bottle of that same wine was opened at a banquet honoring Julius Caesar, aged for more than 6 decades in sealed jars. It was served to the most powerful men in the Roman Republic as a symbol of prestige and the enduring greatness of Rome. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in his great encyclopedia of the natural world, would describe this vintage in reverential terms, making it what we might call the world's first cult wine. Rome's relationship with wine was unlike anything that had come before. Where the Greeks had treated wine as a philosophical pleasure and a gift from the gods, the Romans turned it into something far bigger, an industrial product, a daily necessity, a tool of empire. Wine was consumed at every level of Roman society, from the lavish dinner parties of senators to the cramped taverns that lined the streets of working-class neighborhoods. A free Roman citizen was expected to drink wine. Slaves received a daily ration of a thin drink made from water and wine vinegar. Wine was so much a part of Roman life that going without it was considered a sign of poverty or barbarism. Pliny the Elder, who can fairly be called the world's first wine critic, classified the wine regions of the empire and ranked their products in his encyclopedia. At the very top stood the wines from Mount Phylloxera, which came in 3 recognized types depending on which part of the slope the grapes were grown on. The best of these wines were said to need at least 10 years of aging to reach their peak and to be at their finest between 15 and 20 years old, an aging potential that would impress even modern collectors. Below the top rank came wines from the hills southeast of Rome, from the marshes of southern Latium, and from a host of other regions, each with its own character and reputation. This whole system of ranking wines by where they came from and how long they could age anticipated the famous classification systems of France by nearly 2,000 years. But the most remarkable thing about Roman wine culture was its sheer scale. To keep wine flowing to soldiers, colonists, and citizens across a vast empire, the Romans planted vineyards wherever conditions allowed, and sometimes where they did not. Roman legions carried vine cuttings as they marched through what is now France, Spain, the Rhine Valley, and even Britain, planting vineyards at military camps and new settlements. The commercial opportunities drew merchants into regions that had never known winemaking, and the trade infrastructure that supported all of this was staggering. In Rome itself, the evidence survives in one of the city's most unusual landmarks, an artificial hill called Monte Testaccio, which stands about 35 meters high and measures roughly a kilometer around its base. The hill is made entirely of broken pieces of storage jars, an estimated 53 million of them discarded after their contents, mostly olive oil and wine, had been consumed. At its peak, around 130,000 jars were being dumped on the site each year. It is, in a sense, the largest garbage heap of the ancient world, and it tells us just how much wine and oil was flowing into Rome. The jars themselves were marked with painted inscriptions recording where the contents came from, how much was inside, and who had inspected the shipment, a system of paperwork that was every bit as detailed as anything we use today. One of the most important changes in how wine was stored and shipped happened not in Rome itself, but in the lands of the Gauls, the Celtic peoples of what is now France. When Roman merchants and soldiers arrived in Gaul, they discovered that the locals had developed wooden barrels as an alternative to ceramic jars. The barrel was a game-changing technology. It was lighter, more durable, easier to roll and stack, and could be reused rather than thrown away after a single use. Over the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, the barrel gradually replaced the storage jar as the main container for wine across the western part of the empire. This Gallic invention would go on to dominate wine storage for the next 2,000 years, and the oak barrel remains the most important vessel in winemaking to this day. Roman viticulture in Gaul proved so successful that it eventually began to threaten the wine industry back in Italy. By the 1st century of the Common Era, wines from what is now France were not only satisfying local demand but being shipped back to Rome itself, competing with Italian producers on their home ground. Emperor Domitian, alarmed by this, issued an order around the year 92 of the Common Era to destroy half of all vineyards in the provinces, one of the earliest examples of a government stepping in to control the wine market. The order was widely ignored and eventually reversed nearly 200 years later, but it shows just how central wine had become to the economic calculations of the empire. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 did not destroy European winemaking, but it disrupted it deeply. The vast trade networks that had connected vineyards across the empire to distant markets collapsed. The quality controls and regulations disappeared. Many vineyards were abandoned as populations shrank and order broke down. But wine production continued, sustained not by imperial logistics but by the one institution that survived the fall of Rome with its ability to organize and preserve intact, the Christian Church. The monks who would keep the vineyards alive through the darkest centuries of European history were, in many cases, tending vines that Roman soldiers had planted generations earlier, caring for plants whose ancestors had been carried from the sunny hillsides of Italy to the river valleys of France in the packs of marching legions. And it is to those monks and to the sacred bond between wine and Christianity that our story turns next. On a spring evening in Jerusalem, around the year 30 of the Common Era, a traveling preacher from Galilee sat down to a Passover meal with his closest followers in an upper room. According to the accounts that would later be gathered into the Gospels, Jesus of Nazareth took a cup of wine, blessed it, and told his companions that it was his blood, given for the forgiveness of sins. He asked them to drink it in remembrance of him. That moment, the Last Supper, would transform wine from a beverage into the most sacred substance in the Christian faith, the blood of Christ, whether understood as literal or symbolic depending on what one believes. And in doing so, it would ensure that winemaking survived the collapse of Rome and endured through the darkest centuries of European history. The importance of this cannot be overstated. Every time a priest celebrated the central ritual of Christian worship, wine was needed. Every church, every monastery, every parish in all of Christendom required a steady supply of wine, not as a luxury but as an absolute necessity for worship. No other liquid could take its place. Beer, which was common enough in daily life, could not stand in for wine at the altar. This created an unbreakable link between Christianity and the growing of grapes that would last for 2,000 years. When the Western Roman Empire fell apart in the 5th century, the institutions that had held civilization together, the government, the army, the legal system, the trade routes, all crumbled. But the church endured, and within the church, the monasteries became the last strongholds of organized knowledge and skilled agriculture. The Benedictine order, founded around 529 by a man known as Benedict of Nursia, established a way of life built around two simple principles, prayer and work. The daily rhythm of monastic life alternated between devotion in the chapel and labor in the fields, the vineyard and the cellar. Vineyard work fit beautifully into this rhythm. The slow, patient tasks of pruning, training, and harvesting grapevines required skill and care, but not the kind of urgency that would disrupt the regular schedule of prayers. Monks could tend their vines between the hours of worship, returning to the chapel with soil under their fingernails and the smell of grape juice on their robes. And the monasteries did far more than simply maintain the vineyards that already existed. They systematically improved them. Monks were literate in an age when almost nobody else could read or write, and they kept careful records of their experiments. They compared how different grape varieties performed in different soils. They noted the effects of different pruning methods, different planting arrangements, different harvest times. They experimented with how long to ferment the wine and how best to store it. Over centuries of patient observation and record-keeping, monastic winemakers built up a body of knowledge that was far richer and more detailed than anything that had existed in the Roman world. The Benedictine monastery of Cluny, founded in 910 in the Burgundy region of eastern France, became one of the most powerful religious institutions in medieval Europe and a major force in winemaking. At its peak, Cluny controlled a network of over 1,000 monasteries across the continent, many of them producing wine. The wealth generated by monastic wine sales funded the building of churches, hospitals, and schools, making wine a foundation of medieval charitable work. The Cistercian order, founded in 1098 as a reform movement within the Benedictine tradition, would prove even more important to the story of wine. The Cistercians placed a special emphasis on physical labor and self-sufficiency, and their monks became the most skilled and dedicated grape growers of the medieval world. Cistercian monasteries in Burgundy, along the Rhine, and in Portugal developed vineyards that would become some of the most famous in the world. The founding house of the Cistercian order was located in Burgundy, and the monks there would play a central role in establishing that region's reputation as one of the greatest wine-producing areas on earth. The contributions of the monks went well beyond the vineyard. In the cellar, they developed better ways to clarify wine, to manage the temperature during fermentation, and to age wine in ways that enhanced its quality rather than letting it spoil. The cool stone cellars beneath their monasteries provided ideal conditions for storing wine at a steady temperature, and the monks learned to use these natural advantages with great skill. Monastic wine was not made only for use in worship. While the sacred rituals required wine, the amounts needed were relatively modest. The larger part of what the monasteries produced was sold in local and regional markets, providing income that sustained the community's work in education and charity. This commercial side of monastic winemaking gave the monks a strong reason to produce the best wine they possibly could, a motivation that went hand in hand with their spiritual commitment to doing all things with care and devotion. The church also carried winemaking into new places as Christianity spread. Missionaries established vineyards in regions that the Romans had never reached. In England, cathedral cities maintained vineyards for local use, and the Great Survey of England conducted in 1086 recorded 46 vineyards across the country, a testament to how far the church had pushed winemaking, right up to the very edge of where grapes could ripen. The sacred status of wine also shaped how people in the wider world thought about drinking. While drunkenness was condemned as sinful, moderate wine drinking was openly encouraged by the church as both healthful and proper. This endorsement from the most respected institution in medieval life meant that wine kept its place of honor in European culture even as the classical world that had first celebrated it faded into memory. The transformation of wine from a pagan pleasure into a Christian sacrament was one of the most important turns in the story of this drink. It guaranteed wine's survival through the most turbulent centuries of European history. It gathered the knowledge of winemaking into monastic communities where it could be preserved and improved. And it created the conditions in which the great wine regions of France, Germany, and Portugal would eventually find their identities. When the monks finally gave way to private owners centuries later, those new keepers inherited not just land and vines, but a tradition of care and observation that had been nurtured generation after generation in the name of something sacred. And yet, in another part of the world, a different faith was taking a very different view of the vine and its liquid gift. In the glittering court of Baghdad in the early 9th century, a poet named Abu Nuwas lifted a glass of wine and began to recite. His verses were witty, scandalous, and deliberately bold, joyful celebrations of wine drinking and a life lived in open defiance of religious law. Abu Nuwas, who died around the year 814, was the greatest wine poet of the Islamic world, a man who wrote more than 300 poems in praise of the grape. His wine poems remain widely read in the Arab world to this day, a testament to the enduring tension between the Islamic prohibition of alcohol and the rich literary tradition that celebrates it. The relationship between Islam and wine is far more layered and complicated than a simple story of forbiddance would suggest. The Quran does contain verses that speak against intoxicants, describing them as something to be avoided. The dominant view across most schools of Islamic law holds that the consumption of alcohol in any form is forbidden. But there has never been complete agreement on this point, and in practice, wine drinking continued throughout the Islamic world, particularly among the wealthy and powerful. The rulers of the Umayyad dynasty, who governed from Damascus in the 7th and 8th centuries, were known for their indulgence in wine and courtly pleasures. The Abbasid caliphs who succeeded them were, if anything, even more enthusiastic. The court culture of Baghdad during the golden age of Islamic civilization was suffused with wine served at private gatherings, celebrated in poetry, and consumed by rulers, scholars, and intellectuals, even as the official teaching said otherwise. The gap between doctrine and practice was wide, well known, and openly acknowledged in literature, if not in the courts of law. Persian wine poetry in particular grew into one of the great literary traditions of the world. Omar Khayyam, the 11th century mathematician, astronomer, and poet, wrote short verses that celebrate wine with a depth that goes far beyond simple enjoyment. His poems, which became beloved in the English-speaking world through a famous 19th century translation, present wine as a way of embracing the present moment in the face of life's uncertainty and brevity. Why worry about tomorrow? The poems seem to ask when today offers a cup of wine and the company of a friend. Hafez of Shiraz, the 14th century Persian master, took this tradition even further. In his poetry, wine becomes a symbol not just of earthly pleasure but of spiritual longing, the desire for union with the divine. In the mystical tradition of Sufism, wine is understood as a metaphor for the overwhelming experience of closeness to God, the ultimate intoxication, one that transcends the physical substance while drawing its power from all the feelings we associate with it. This is perhaps the most beautiful paradox in the entire story of wine. A faith that forbids drinking produced some of the most exquisite writing about wine ever composed in any language. The tension between the rule and the desire, between what is forbidden and what is longed for, gave rise to poetry of extraordinary power and beauty. The paradox goes deeper still when we consider the contributions that Muslim scholars made to the science of alcohol. It was Arab and Persian alchemists who developed the technology of distillation, the process of heating a liquid and collecting the concentrated vapors. The very word alcohol comes from an Arabic word, and the apparatus used for distillation takes its name from Arabic as well. Muslim chemists created the technological foundation for making spirits, even while their own religious tradition prohibited drinking the results. The impact of Islamic rule on winemaking varied greatly from one region to another. In North Africa, where wine had been made since the time of the Phoenicians and Romans, many vineyards were converted to growing grapes for eating or drying into raisins. The fruit of the vine was still valued, but its fermented form was discouraged. In the lands of the Levant, centuries of continuous winemaking were disrupted but never entirely wiped out. In Persia, the homeland of the great wine poets, grapes continued to be grown, though whether for wine or for other purposes was often left deliberately unclear. In Islamic Spain, where Arab, North African, and Iberian cultures blended together, the vineyards that had been planted by Phoenicians and Romans centuries earlier were not destroyed. They continued to produce wine for the Christian communities living under Muslim rule, for export to non-Muslim markets, and, quietly, for the Muslim ruling class who chose to look the other way. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled much of the Middle East and southeastern Europe for centuries, handled the situation with a practical compromise. Wine production was largely left to the non-Muslim communities within the empire, the Greeks, Armenians, and Jews who were permitted to make and drink wine as part of the arrangements governing their religious communities. The Ottoman capital of Istanbul had a lively wine culture centered on the taverns of a particular district, where foreign merchants, diplomats, and locals who were willing to bend the rules gathered to drink together. The Mughal emperors of India present yet another variation on this theme. The Mughals, who ruled much of the Indian subcontinent from the 16th century onward, had complicated and shifting relationships with alcohol. The founder of the dynasty reportedly enjoyed wine before making a vow of abstinence late in life. One of his descendants was an acknowledged heavy drinker whose habits shaped the affairs of his kingdom. The Mughal court swung between periods of strict prohibition and open indulgence, reflecting the broader tension within Islamic civilization between the ideal and the human reality. The legacy of this long, complicated relationship is paradoxical and deep. On one hand, Islamic prohibition contributed to the decline of winemaking in regions that had been producing wine for thousands of years. On the other hand, Muslim scholars preserved and passed on the agricultural and scientific knowledge of the ancient world, including knowledge about growing grapes. The technologies developed by Muslim chemists, distillation above all, would eventually transform the entire world of alcoholic drinks. And the wine poetry of the Islamic tradition stands as one of the highest achievements of world literature, a tradition in which the forbidden cup becomes a vessel for the deepest questions about pleasure, time, and the meaning of being alive. And now, let us return to the vineyards of Christian Europe, where the monks we met earlier were about to do something remarkable in the hills of a region called Burgundy. Picture a monk kneeling in a vineyard in eastern France, sometime in the 12th century. He is not praying, not at this moment. He is doing something far more unusual. He is tasting the soil. He lifts a handful of earth to his nose, crumbles it between his fingers, and notes that it is different, just slightly, from the soil in the plot next door. The vines growing here on this particular slope of clay and limestone have produced better wine, year after year, than the vines growing 50 steps away on what appears to be an identical hillside. And he writes it down. He adds this observation to a journal that stretches back generations, to a growing body of knowledge about which plots are extraordinary and which are merely good. That monk, whose name we will never know, was part of one of the most remarkable experiments in the history of farming. He belonged to the Cistercian order, a community of monks founded in 1098 at the Abbey of Citeaux, just south of the city of Dijon. The Cistercians lived by a rule that divided each day between prayer and physical labor. And for these monks, that labor was often vineyard work, performed with a level of care and attention that no one else in medieval Europe could match. They were not the first to notice that different places produced different wines. The ancient Greeks knew that wine from one island tasted different from wine from another. The Romans understood that the location of a vineyard mattered as much as the type of grape planted in it. But the Cistercians went much further than anyone before them. They turned observation into a system. They mapped their vineyards with a precision that would not be equaled for centuries. And they discovered something that wine lovers still argue about today, the idea that the French would eventually call terroir, the notion that wine is shaped by its place, by the particular combination of soil, slope, sunlight, and climate that exists in one spot and nowhere else. The Benedictine monastery of Cluny, founded in 910, had been the first great monastic force in the wine country of Burgundy. The monks of Cluny gathered vineyard land through gifts and purchases, steadily building their holdings across the region. But it was the Cistercians who became the most important winemakers of the medieval world. Their discipline was extraordinary. They observed that vines growing in thin, stony, well-drained soil produced more concentrated wine than those in richer earth. They noticed that south-facing slopes bathed in more sunlight ripened their grapes more fully. They learned that vineyards in the middle of a hillside, protected from frost and blessed with good drainage, made the finest wine of all. Over decades and centuries, this patient work of tasting, recording, and comparing created a detailed map of quality. The monks built stone walls around their best vineyards, enclosures they called clos, marking the boundaries between one precious plot and the next. The most famous of these walled vineyards, the Clos de Vougeot, was assembled piece by piece over more than 200 years, reaching its full size by 1336. It is still one of the most celebrated vineyards in the world today. Can you picture those monks working in silence, their robes tucked up, their hands dark with soil? They did not have the words for what they were discovering. The science of soil, the study of tiny variations in climate, these things lay far in the future. They had only their senses and their patience, and the slow accumulation of knowledge passed down from one generation of monks to the next. The rulers of Burgundy took notice of what the monks were achieving. In 1395, Duke Philip the Bold issued a famous order banning a particular grape variety from the best vineyards. He called it a disloyal grape, one that grew too easily and produced too much mediocre wine. In its place, he demanded a finer, more temperamental variety, the grape we now know as Pinot Noir. Whatever his reasons, political or practical, his order sealed the fate of Burgundy's vineyards. From that moment on, Pinot Noir would be the signature grape of the region. The monks did not stop at mapping their vineyards. In their cellars, cool and dark beneath stone walls, they experimented with every part of the winemaking process. They tested different harvest times, discovering that waiting longer produced richer wine, while picking earlier gave wine more freshness and light. They learned that the first pressing of the grapes yielded the finest juice, and that each pressing after that was a little coarser than the one before. Their cellars at the Clos de Vougeot, built in the 12th century and still standing, were among the most advanced winemaking facilities of the medieval world. The French Revolution of 1789 brought all of this to a sudden end. When the new government seized the property of the church, the great monastic vineyards were sold and divided among private owners. A single vineyard that had once been cared for by a single community of monks was now split among a dozen or more individuals, each tending their own small piece. This pattern of fragmented ownership defines Burgundy to this day, and it is both a burden and a gift, making the region wonderfully diverse but almost impossibly complicated to understand. The monks themselves vanished from the vineyards, but their legacy endures in every bottle of Burgundy wine. The system of carefully defined plots, each with its own name and reputation, each recognized as producing wine of a distinct character, this is their invention. In 2015, these plots were inscribed as a World Heritage Site, a lasting tribute to the generations of monks who first noticed that wine, more than almost any other thing we eat or drink, belongs to the place where it was born. And from the quiet hillsides of Burgundy, let us now travel westward and northward to the great port city of Bordeaux, where a royal marriage was about to change the history of wine forever. In the spring of 1152, in the Cathedral of Poitiers, a wedding took place that would shape the history of wine for centuries. The bride was Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in the medieval world. The groom was Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become King Henry II of England. Eleanor brought with her an enormous inheritance, a territory stretching from the Loire Valley to the Pyrenees. And tucked within that territory was a port city surrounded by vineyards, a city called Bordeaux. With this single marriage, England gained control of one of the finest wine-producing regions in France. And the English, it turned out, were very thirsty indeed. The timing could not have been better. England had been growing its own wine since Roman times, with small vineyards scattered across the southern counties. But the climate was cooling, and English grapes were becoming harder and harder to ripen. Just as domestic wine production was fading, Eleanor's marriage placed a ready supply of French wine at England's doorstep. It was one of those quiet accidents of history, a marriage of politics and geography that nobody planned but that changed everything. The wine trade between Bordeaux and England grew quickly into one of the most important commercial relationships of the medieval world. English cloth and tin sailed south to Bordeaux. Bordeaux wines sailed north to England. Twice a year before Christmas and before Easter, enormous fleets of ships, sometimes 200 vessels or more, left England for Bordeaux and returned loaded with barrels of the newest vintage. The wine itself was called claret, from a French word meaning light or clear. Medieval claret was a pale red wine, much lighter than what we would recognize as Bordeaux today. It was made to be drunk young, within a year of the harvest, before it had time to turn. It was refreshing, easy to enjoy, and utterly unlike the heavy-aged wines that Bordeaux would later become famous for. The English loved it beyond all reason. During the reigns of Eleanor and her descendants, more wine was imported into Britain than is imported today, and that is a striking thought when you consider that medieval England had only a small fraction of the modern population. By the early 1300s, Bordeaux was shipping roughly 100,000 large barrels of wine to England every year. That works out to something like 90 million litres, enough wine to give every man, woman and child in England a generous daily cup. Can you imagine the scene at a medieval English port? Ships arriving heavy with barrels, the smell of wine and salt water mixing on the docks, workers rolling the casks up the hill to the warehouses. Wine was not a luxury in medieval England. For those who could afford it, it was as everyday as bread. This trade was not merely about commerce. It was deeply political as well. The English crown earned substantial revenue from duties on wine, and the prosperity of the Bordeaux merchants depended entirely on continued English control of the region. Each side needed the other, and this mutual dependence made the wine trade a matter of national importance. Bordeaux merchants lobbied the English kings for favorable trade terms. English kings protected Bordeaux as a vital part of their French territories. Then came the 100 Years' War, beginning in 1337. For more than a century, English and French armies fought across southwestern France, and the wine trade suffered terribly. Shipments were disrupted by warfare, by piracy, by the simple danger of sending ships through contested waters. And yet the trade never stopped entirely. Merchants on both sides were determined to keep their business alive, and wine continued to flow from Bordeaux to England, though in smaller quantities and at higher prices. The final blow fell in 1453 when the French army won the Battle of Castillon and reclaimed Bordeaux after 300 years of English rule. The merchants of Bordeaux were reportedly devastated, not by the military defeat, but by the loss of their privileged trading arrangement with England. Under French rule, they would have to compete with every other wine region in France without the special treatment that English rule had provided. The consequences rippled outward in unexpected ways. Cut off from their favorite wine, the English began looking for substitutes. They turned to Portugal, to the heavy wines of the Douro Valley that would eventually become port. Dutch merchants stepped in to fill the gap, bringing wines from all across Europe. The English taste for strong, fortified wines, port and sherry and Madeira that developed over the following centuries was, in large part, a consequence of losing Bordeaux. But the English never stopped loving claret. Even after Bordeaux returned to French hands, English merchants continued to buy its wine, and the English aristocracy maintained its deep affection for red Bordeaux. This enduring demand would shape the region for centuries to come, encouraging the production of higher quality wines aimed at the wealthy English market and eventually helping to create the great estates and the classification system that define Bordeaux today. The word claret itself became a permanent part of the English language, a small fossil of a medieval trading relationship that shaped two nations and established Bordeaux as the most commercially important wine region on earth. And the pattern that Bordeaux and England established, wine as an international commodity shaped by the demands of distant markets, would repeat itself again and again across the centuries to come. Let us now travel around the Mediterranean to the sun-baked towns and hillside vineyards of Spain, Italy, Hungary, and Portugal, where a whole mosaic of wine traditions was taking shape. In the far south of Spain, in the sun-baked town of Jerez, a tradition of winemaking stretches back over 3,000 years, all the way to the Phoenician settlers who first planted grapevines along the river around 1100 years before the Common Era. When the Moors conquered the region in 711, they brought with them a remarkable invention, a piece of equipment that could heat a liquid and capture the concentrated vapors that rose from it. This technology, developed by Arab and Persian chemists, would eventually give birth to one of the most distinctive wines in the world, a wine we now call sherry. There is a lovely irony here, one worth pausing on. A Muslim civilization provided the technological foundation for making a fortified wine, a drink strengthened with additional alcohol, even as Islamic teaching cautioned against drinking any alcohol at all. That kind of contradiction runs through the entire story of Mediterranean wine, and it is part of what makes it so rich. After the Christian reconquest of Jerez in 1264, winemaking continued under new rulers who inherited both the old grape varieties and the new distillation technology. By the 15th century, sherry had become one of Spain's most important exports. The English, always thirsty, discovered it through a dramatic introduction. In 1587, the English sea captain Francis Drake attacked the Spanish port of Cadiz and seized nearly 3,000 barrels of sherry, which he carried back to England. The playwright Shakespeare mentioned sherry repeatedly in his plays, calling it sack, and the English appetite for this golden, nutty wine would drive the development of the unique blending system that defines sherry to this day. Across the Mediterranean in Tuscany, another wine tradition was quietly taking shape. The hilltop villages at the heart of the Tuscan countryside had been growing grapes since the Middle Ages, and the first written mention of the wine we call Chianti dates to 1398. By the Renaissance, Chianti was the wine of Florence, the drink of wealthy merchants and banking families, a symbol of the prosperity and refinement that made Tuscany one of the most celebrated regions in Europe. In 1716, the Grand Duke of Tuscany did something remarkable. He issued an official order that formally marked the boundaries within which wine could be called Chianti, making it the world's first officially protected wine region more than 200 years before the French created their own system. Even at that early date, people understood that the name on a wine bottle carried real value, and that value needed protection. Later, in the 1870s, a nobleman who also happened to be a politician and twice served as the Prime Minister of Italy would develop a particular recipe for making Chianti at his family estate in the rolling hills, a formula that would serve as the foundation for the region's regulations for nearly a century. Let us travel now to a very different landscape, the wooded hills of northeastern Hungary. There, in the foothills of a small mountain range, winemakers had been growing grapes since at least the 12th century. But their most remarkable creation came from a happy accident of nature, a particular type of mold that occasionally settled on ripe grapes in the autumn mists, shriveling the fruit and concentrating the sugars inside to an extraordinary degree. The wine made from these shriveled, moldy grapes was astonishingly sweet and complex, with flavors of honey, apricot, and warm spices. This wine from the region of Tokaj, reached its golden moment in 1703 when a prince presented bottles of it to the French king, Louis XIV. The Sun King tasted it and declared it, so the story goes, the wine of kings and the king of wines. That endorsement launched the wine to the very top of European society. Peter the Great of Russia reportedly ordered 600 barrels a year. Other rulers competed to impress their guests with it. The wine became a tool of diplomacy, exchanged between monarchs as a symbol of friendship and respect. Far out in the Atlantic, on a Portuguese island called Madeira, yet another unique wine emerged through a combination of geography and happy accident. The wine of Madeira was originally nothing special, a simple table wine. But the long sea voyages that ships from the island undertook, crossing the equator on their way to the Americas or the East Indies, subjected the wine to extreme heat and constant rocking, rather than ruining it. This treatment produced a rich, caramelized, nutty flavor that people found wonderful. Winemakers began deliberately copying the effect, heating their wines and adding grape brandy to create one of the most durable wines ever made. A bottle of Madeira from the 1700s, properly kept, can still be enjoyed today, centuries after it was made. And then there is port, born from the Douro Valley of northern Portugal. English merchants, unable to get their beloved claret during periods of conflict with France, turned to Portuguese wines as a substitute. They discovered that adding brandy to partially fermented wine produced something remarkable, a sweet, strong, stable drink that survived the long sea journey and aged beautifully in the cellar. A trade agreement in 1703 reduced the taxes on Portuguese wines entering England, and port became one of the most celebrated wines in the world. Each of these traditions, sherry in southern Spain, Chianti in Tuscany, the sweet wines of Tokaj, the fortified wines of Madeira and Portugal, represents a unique answer to the question of what wine can be. Together, they form a patchwork of styles and stories as diverse as the Mediterranean world itself, proof that the same simple act of fermenting grapes can produce an almost infinite variety of pleasures. And now, let us turn our attention to a particular corner of northeastern France, where something entirely new was about to happen inside a bottle. There is a legend that goes like this. In the late 1600s, a blind Benedictine monk at an abbey in northeastern France opened a bottle of wine, tasted the fizzing liquid inside, and called out to his fellow monks, "Come quickly, I am drinking the stars." It is one of the most beautiful origin stories in all of wine history, and it is almost entirely made up. The real story of how sparkling wine came to be is more complicated, less romantic, and considerably more interesting than the myth. It involves not one person but many, spans not a single moment but centuries of gradual discovery, and begins not in France but in England, a detail that the great sparkling wine houses of France have never been eager to share. The region of Champagne in northeastern France had been making still wines for centuries, but its cool northern climate created a persistent problem. When autumn arrived and temperatures dropped, the tiny organisms responsible for turning grape juice into wine sometimes stopped working before they had finished the job. Sugar remained in the wine, unfinished. Then, when spring came and the warmth returned, those dormant organisms woke up and started working again, producing a gas that had nowhere to go if the wine happened to be sealed inside a bottle. The result was pressure, fizz, and all too often a bottle that shattered in the cellar. Far from being a desirable quality, these bubbles were considered a serious flaw, a sign that the winemaker had failed. The famous monk, whose name was Dom Pierre Perignon, served as cellar master at the Abbey of Hautevillers from 1668 until his death in 1715. His real contributions to winemaking were considerable, but they had nothing to do with inventing bubbles. He was a gifted blender who pioneered the practice of combining grapes from different vineyards to create wines of greater depth. He improved pressing methods to produce white wines of exceptional clarity from dark-skinned grapes. He was meticulous about every detail, but he spent much of his career trying to prevent bubbles, not create them. The first person to describe the deliberate process of making sparkling wine was, in fact, an English scientist. In 1662, 6 years before Dom Perignon even arrived at Hautevillers, a physician named Christopher Merritt presented a paper to the Royal Society in London describing how adding sugar to a finished wine would start a second round of fermentation and produce bubbles. This is the earliest written description of the technique that defines sparkling wine production to this day. The English had another advantage. Their glassmakers, who used hotter furnaces fueled by coal rather than wood, were producing bottles that were significantly stronger than anything available in France. French bottles of the era were thin and fragile, and they often exploded under the pressure of trapped gas. English bottles could hold it. The English also had access to cork from Portugal and Spain, which provided a much better seal than the oiled rags or wooden plugs that French winemakers typically used. Stronger glass and better corks made sparkling wine practical in England before it was possible in France. But it was the French who would perfect the art and turn it into a global symbol. And the key figure in that transformation was not a monk, but a woman. Her name was Barbé Nicole Clicquot Ponsardin, and she is better known to history as the Widow Clicquot. When her husband died in 1805, she was 27 years old, with a struggling wine business on her hands. She took charge of the company and proceeded to change the entire sparkling wine industry. Her greatest invention solved a stubborn problem. During the second fermentation that created the bubbles, dead yeast cells accumulated inside the bottle as a cloudy deposit. Earlier methods of removing this sediment were clumsy and wasteful, and they often cost the wine much of its precious fizz. Working with her cellar master, Madame Clicquot, developed a system of gradually tilting the bottles from horizontal to nearly upside down over a period of weeks, rotating each one just slightly each day. This gentle process coaxed the sediment into the neck of the bottle, where it could be removed in a single quick motion. The special rack she designed for this purpose became standard equipment in every sparkling wine house. She was also a brilliant businesswoman. During the chaos of the wars that swept across Europe in the early 1800s, she smuggled bottles of her wine to the Russian court, building a loyal following among the Russian aristocracy that would support her business for decades. She created what is believed to be the first vintage sparkling wine, selecting wine from a single exceptional harvest rather than blending across years. She is credited with the first blended pink sparkling wine. The commercial houses that grew up around this industry read like a list of the most famous names in wine. One house was founded by a man who befriended Napoleon and supplied his armies. A German immigrant who had worked for that house eventually left to start his own, building what many consider the most uncompromising producer in history. Another house created a special bottle for the Russian emperor, with clear glass and a flat bottom, because the emperor was worried about assassins hiding a weapon inside an opaque bottle. The story of how sparkling wine became the world's most celebrated luxury drink is not the story of any single inventor. It is the work of an English scientist who understood the chemistry, English glassmakers who solved the packaging, a French monk who improved the base wine, a young widow who perfected the production process, and a collection of ambitious houses that built the commercial empire and the mythology. Today, the sound of a cork popping is the universal signal for celebration, a sound that connects a birthday party in Tokyo to a wedding in Buenos Aires, all echoing back to a cold corner of France where monks once cursed the bubbles in their wine. And now the story of wine is about to cross the ocean as European ships carry vine cuttings to distant continents where no one has ever made wine before. On a spring morning in 1659, at a small settlement clinging to the base of a great flat-topped mountain at the southern tip of Africa, a Dutch administrator named Jan van Riebeek recorded in his diary a moment that would mark the beginning of winemaking on a new continent. He had just pressed the first grapes grown at the Cape of Good Hope. The wine, by all accounts, was not very good. Van Riebeeck was a soldier and a bureaucrat, not a winemaker. The vines had been planted for a practical reason, to provide something rich in the nutrients that sailors lacked on their long voyages. But however humble that first pressing was, it marked the start of a tradition that would eventually produce some of the finest wines in the Southern Hemisphere. The Cape's real potential was recognized by Van Riebeeck's successor, a man who arrived in 1679 with genuine knowledge of how to grow grapes. He found a sheltered valley southeast of the mountain with ideal conditions and established an estate that would become the most celebrated vineyard south of the equator. The sweet wines produced there would eventually win admirers across Europe. Napoleon himself reportedly requested them during his exile, and they were praised by some of the finest writers of the age. For a time, this was the first wine from outside Europe to achieve true international fame. But the South African story was not the first chapter in wine's great ocean crossing. That distinction belongs to the Americas, and the story begins with the very first Spanish ships to arrive in the New World. The Spanish found a continent rich in wild grapes, dozens of species growing from Canada to the southernmost tip of South America, but none of them produced wine that European palates found acceptable. The fruit had a particular musky flavor that made it unsuitable for winemaking in the way the Spanish understood it. If the Americas were to have wine, European vines would have to be carried across the Atlantic. The first successful transplanting happened in Mexico, making it the first wine-producing country in the New World. In the 1530s, Spanish settlers were growing grapes and making wine in the highlands around Mexico City. The industry grew so successfully that it began to threaten wine exports from Spain itself, prompting the Spanish king to ban the planting of new vineyards in Mexico in 1595, one of the earliest examples of a colonial power protecting its own trade by stifling the colony's ambitions. From Mexico, the vine traveled south, carried by missionaries who needed wine for their religious services. The grape variety they planted most widely was a hardy, productive vine that came to be known by different names in different countries, a reliable workhorse of uncertain European origin that could survive the rough conditions of colonial farming. Missionaries in Peru were making wine by the 1540s, and from Peru, vines reached Chile, where the first grapes were planted near Santiago in 1554. Within a few decades, Chile was producing enough wine to supply its own population and export to its neighbors. Argentina's wine story began in much the same way. Missionaries established vineyards around the city of Mendoza in the 1550s and 1560s, planting their vines in the dry foothills of the Andes, where snowmelt from the mountains provided the water that the sparse rainfall could not. The foundation was laid for what would one day become one of the most important wine-producing countries in the world, though that day was still centuries away. The situation was very different on the other side of the Americas. In eastern North America, European colonists tried again and again to grow European grapes and failed again and again. The English settlers who arrived in Virginia in 1607 had been given explicit instructions to develop a wine industry. They planted European vines and watched them die. They replanted, and the vines died again. They blamed the soil, the cold winters, their own lack of experience. But the real enemy was something they could not see, a tiny insect living in the soil of eastern North America, one that fed on the roots of grapevines and killed them within a year or two. American grape species had evolved alongside this insect over millions of years and had developed a natural defense against it. European vines had no such protection and were utterly helpless. For over 200 years, every attempt to grow European grapes in the eastern colonies ended in failure. Thomas Jefferson, one of the great wine lovers among America's founders, spent decades trying to grow European grapes at his Virginia estate and failed every single time. He never knew the reason why. Meanwhile, on the far side of the world, the English were bringing vines to Australia. The first grapevines were planted near Sydney in the 1790s, but the humid coastal climate was not kind to them. It was only when settlers pushed inland that they found the warm, dry conditions that grapevines preferred. A Scottish immigrant planted vines along a river north of Sydney in 1824 and would spend his life building Australian winemaking on a proper foundation. He travelled to France and Spain and returned with hundreds of different vine cuttings, including the variety that would become the foundation of Australian red wine. German settlers, fleeing religious persecution in Europe, arrived in the Barossa Valley in the 1840s and brought with them a deep knowledge of winemaking. Some of the vines they planted are still producing wine today. Nearly 2 centuries later, the oldest continuously producing vines of their kind anywhere on Earth. By the middle of the 1800s, wine had completed its migration from the Old World to every inhabited continent. The vine had been carried by soldiers, priests, administrators, and dreamers to places nature had never intended it to grow. Some of those transplanted vines would fail. Others would produce wines that would one day rival or surpass their European ancestors. The age of exploration had not merely expanded the world's geography, it had expanded its vineyards. And back in France, a chemist was about to look through a microscope and discover the secret that had eluded winemakers for thousands of years, the true nature of fermentation itself. In the autumn of 1863, a 40-year-old chemist named Louis Pasteur received an unusual request from the most powerful man in France. Emperor Napoleon III was worried. French wine, the nation's most important agricultural product and a source of deep national pride, was going bad. Enormous quantities of it were turning to vinegar before it could be sold, and the financial losses were devastating. The emperor asked Pasteur to find out why. What Pasteur discovered in the course of this investigation would not only save the French wine industry, it would transform our understanding of the invisible world of living things too small to see with the naked eye. At the time, the leading scientific theory held that fermentation was a purely chemical reaction, a spontaneous transformation of sugar into alcohol that needed no help from any living creature. This was the view of one of the most respected chemists in Europe, who insisted that the idea of tiny living organisms causing a chemical reaction was as absurd as suggesting that tiny living organisms made a river flow. Pasteur set out to prove him wrong. Working in his laboratory in Paris, Pasteur conducted a series of careful experiments using microscopes, sealed flasks, and tightly controlled conditions. He showed, conclusively, that fermentation was not chemistry alone. It was the work of living things. The tiny single-celled organisms called yeast, which had been observed floating in fermenting liquids for years but dismissed as a mere byproduct, were in fact the cause of the entire process. Without living yeast, no fermentation could occur. Grape juice would remain grape juice forever. Think about what that meant for a moment. Every glass of wine that had ever been made, from the earliest clay jars in the mountains of the Caucasus to the finest barrels of Bordeaux, had been the work of billions of microscopic living things, working together in a process that no one had understood for 8,000 years. The mystery of wine, the ancient miracle of grape juice transforming into something altogether different, had finally been explained. But Pasteur's most commercially important discovery was not about yeast. It was about a different kind of tiny organism, a type of bacteria that was contaminating the wine and turning it sour. He found that this bacterium converted the alcohol in wine into vinegar when exposed to air, and that other bacteria caused other unpleasant flavors, bitterness, ropiness, and strange medicinal tastes that made wine impossible to sell. The solution he proposed was elegant in its simplicity. Heat the wine gently, just enough to kill the unwanted bacteria, but not enough to change the wine's flavor. This process, which Pasteur developed for wine and later applied to beer and milk, became one of the most important advances in the history of public health, though many winemakers were reluctant to adopt it, fearing that heating their wine would rob it of character and life. Pasteur published his findings in 1866 in a groundbreaking book, a detailed investigation of wine diseases and their remedies that remains a cornerstone of wine science. He wrote it in clear, practical language, knowing that the winemakers who most needed his advice were not scientists but farmers. Pasteur was not the first scientist to look at wine with a careful eye. Decades earlier, a French chemist had addressed a different problem: the difficulty of making wine in cold, cloudy years, when grapes did not ripen fully and their juice lacked enough sugar for a proper fermentation. His solution was straightforward: add a little sugar to the grape juice before fermentation begins, not to make the wine sweet, but to give the yeast enough material to work with. This practice was adopted across the cooler wine regions of France and Germany and is still permitted in many places today, though it is banned in warmer regions where grapes have plenty of sugar on their own. After Pasteur, the science of wine advanced quickly. A Danish scientist working at a laboratory in Copenhagen in the 1880s figured out how to isolate individual strains of yeast, making it possible for winemakers to choose specific varieties for specific purposes, rather than relying on the wild, unpredictable mix of organisms that happen to live in their cellars. This gave winemakers enormous control over fermentation, allowing them to produce wines of consistent quality. But it also sparked a debate that continues to this day, because some believe that using a single laboratory-grown strain of yeast strips wine of the individuality and surprise that comes from letting nature take its course. The 20th century brought still more discoveries. A professor at the University of Bordeaux virtually reinvented modern winemaking in the 1950s and 60s through his research into a second, quieter fermentation that happens after the main one, a process in which bacteria soften the sharp acidity of young wine and give it a rounder, smoother feel. His work on temperature control, hygiene, and the careful use of oak barrels transformed Bordeaux and, through his many students, spread these practices to wine regions around the world. In Australia, a research institute founded in the 1950s became a global leader in vine and wine science. In California, a university department became the most influential wine school in the New World, training generations of winemakers who would go on to lead a revolution in American wine. The transformation of winemaking from an ancient craft into a modern science was not without tension. The French idea that great wine is an expression of a specific place sits uneasily beside the scientific approach, which suggests that wine can be improved, controlled, and optimized through technique and knowledge. That debate between the laboratory and the vineyard, between precision and poetry, remains one of the most passionate arguments in the wine world. But there is no question that Pasteur's discovery, that wine is the work of living things, changed forever how we make, understand, and appreciate what is in the glass. And just as science was beginning to unlock the secrets of fermentation, a catastrophe was gathering, one that would nearly destroy every vineyard in Europe. In the summer of 1863, a vine grower in the south of France noticed something strange in his vineyard. A patch of vines that had been perfectly healthy the year before was now sickly, the leaves turning yellow, the fruit shriveled and small. By the following spring, those vines were dead, and the circle of death was spreading outward, creeping into the neighboring rows, unstoppable. Nothing the farmer did. No amount of water, no fertilizer, no pruning could slow it down. Within a few years, the mysterious disease had appeared in vineyards all across southern France. Within a decade, it had reached Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Rhone Valley. Within 2 decades, it had crossed the borders of France into Spain, Italy, Germany, Portugal, and Greece. By the end of the 19th century, it had destroyed virtually every vineyard in Europe, wiping out an industry that had existed for 2,000 years and threatening to erase the culture of wine from the continent entirely. The cause of this disaster was an insect so tiny it was nearly invisible to the naked eye, a pale yellow creature that fed on the roots of grapevines. It had arrived in Europe from the eastern part of North America, traveling aboard vine specimens imported by botanical collectors and nurseries. In its homeland, this insect was a minor pest, held in check by the natural resistance that American grapevines had developed over millions of years of living alongside it. American vine roots had evolved a thick, corky bark that could heal around the wounds made by the feeding insect, limiting the damage. But European vines had never encountered this creature before. They had no defense at all. When the insect punctured the tender roots of a European vine, the wounds became infected, the root system rotted, and the vine died within 1 to 3 years. Here is a quiet irony worth noting. The insect had been able to survive the ocean crossing thanks to a marvel of modern technology, the steamship. On the older, slower sailing vessels, any insects clinging to imported vines typically died during the weeks-long journey. But the new steamships were fast enough to deliver them alive. The same progress that was connecting the world was also unleashing a biological catastrophe. The French government, desperate for a solution, offered an enormous cash prize to anyone who could find a cure. Thousands of remedies were proposed. Some growers flooded their vineyards with water trying to drown the insects. Others buried toads at the base of each vine, hoping the toads would eat the pests. Some injected a toxic, explosive chemical into the soil, which killed the insect but poisoned everything else as well. A few discovered that the insect could not move through sand, and vineyards planted in sandy soil did survive, but most wine regions had no such soil to work with. A professor of botany at the University of Montpellier was the first to identify the insect in 1868, examining the roots of dying vines under a microscope and finding them covered with the tiny yellow creatures. But knowing what was killing the vines was very different from knowing how to stop it. The solution came from an unexpected place. An American scientist studying the insect in its native habitat in the state of Missouri realized that American grapevines were resistant to the pest because their roots had evolved to withstand its attacks. He proposed a daring idea. What if European vines could be saved by grafting the upper part of the vine, the part that produced the grapes and gave the wine its character, onto the root system of an American vine, which would provide the protection that European roots could not? The idea was brilliant, but it was fiercely resisted. French grape growers were horrified at the thought of planting American vines, plants they considered inferior in their sacred vineyards. Many feared that growing European grapes on American roots would change the taste of the wine, that the identity of Burgundy or Bordeaux would be lost forever. Nationalists objected on principle. A bitter argument raged for years between those who supported the American rootstock solution and those who insisted that chemical treatments could defeat the insect without any help from across the Atlantic. In the end, the supporters of grafting won because there was simply no alternative. By the 1880s, the destruction was so complete that resistance was futile. Thousands of tons of American vinewood were shipped to the ports of France, and the enormous task of rebuilding the vineyards began. Each European vine had to be carefully joined to an American root, a skilled and painstaking operation that took decades to complete across the continent. More than 2.5 million hectares of French vineyards were destroyed. The cost of the epidemic and the replanting effort was staggering, equivalent to the entire sum that France had paid to Prussia after losing a major war just a few years earlier. The epidemic reshaped the geography and culture of wine in ways that are still felt today. Many grape varieties that had existed before the crisis were never replanted, lost forever. Regional wine characters changed as different rootstocks interacted with different soils in unpredictable ways. The epidemic accelerated the depopulation of rural France as families who had grown grapes for generations walked away from their dead vineyards and moved to the cities. And it fueled the wine fraud that would eventually lead to new laws protecting the names and identities of wine regions. A few places escaped the devastation. Chile, protected by the Andes, the Pacific Ocean, and the desert, was never reached by the insect, and its vines planted before the crisis survive on their own roots to this day. Parts of Australia, particularly old vineyards in South Australia, also escaped. Today, virtually every European grapevine in the world grows on American rootstock. The French vines that produce Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Champagne are, from the ground down, American plants. It is one of the most remarkable facts in the entire history of farming. The ancient wine traditions of Europe survive only because they were saved by the New World, grafted onto the roots of the very continent that nearly destroyed them. And even as the vineyards were being rebuilt, another force was reshaping the world of wine, an obsession with ranking and classifying that would define how we think about wine for the next 2 centuries. In the spring of 1855, the Emperor of France gave an instruction that would echo through the wine world for the next 170 years. Napoleon III was planning a grand exhibition in Paris, designed to showcase the splendor of his empire to the world. He wanted the finest wines of Bordeaux on display, and he wanted a ranking, a clear list that told everyone which estates made the best wine. The task was handed to the Guild of Winebrokers in Bordeaux, men who had been buying and selling wine for generations and who knew, better than anyone, which estates commanded the highest prices. Working quickly, the brokers compiled a list of 58 estates arranged into 5 tiers, from the very finest at the top to the merely excellent at the bottom. Their method was remarkably simple. They ranked the wines by how much they had sold for, on average over the previous century. The estates that had consistently fetched the highest prices went to the top. Those that had sold for less went to the lower tiers. At the summit, they placed 4 estates in the highest category, the 4 wines that the Bordeaux market considered the best in the world. The ranking was meant to be a snapshot, a practical guide for visitors to the exhibition. Nobody involved imagined that it would still be in use, virtually unchanged, more than a century and a half later. But that is exactly what happened. The 1855 classification became one of the most enduring and controversial documents in the history of wine. It froze a hierarchy in place, and that hierarchy has proven almost impossible to change. The classification was remarkable in several ways. It ranked estates rather than vineyards, reflecting the commercial reality of Bordeaux, where wines were known by the name of the property that made them rather than the specific patch of land where the grapes grew. It focused almost entirely on one district north of the city, the long, gravelly peninsula where the most prestigious red wines were made. Only one estate from outside that district was included, a property that had been famous since the 1600s. Its wines had been so renowned that an English diarist had written about drinking them as early as 1663. Leaving it out would have made the entire ranking a joke. The most controversial moment in the classification's history involved an estate that was placed at the very top of the second tier, a position that the family who owned it considered an insult. The owner, who took charge of the estate in 1922, spent the next 50 years campaigning to have his property promoted to the highest level. His motto became famous in the wine world, a declaration that he refused to accept second place. In 1973, after decades of relentless lobbying and consistently producing wine that equaled or surpassed the top tier, he succeeded. A government minister signed the order elevating the estate to the highest rank, the only change ever made to the classification. The owner promptly changed his motto to celebrate, declaring in the same spirit of defiance that he was now first and always would be. The fact that this is the only change in 170 years tells you something about how rigid the system has become. In the years since the brokers drew up their list, the quality of individual estates has risen and fallen dramatically. Some properties placed in the lower tiers now regularly produce wine that is better than some in the higher tiers. New estates have emerged that make wine of undeniable quality, but will never appear on the list because the list was closed in 1855. The classification has been called an outdated relic, a distortion of the market, a monument to a vanished era. And yet it persists, defended by the estates who benefit from it and trusted by collectors who find comfort in its apparent certainty. Bordeaux was not the only region to develop a system for ranking its wines. In Burgundy, the approach was different. Rather than ranking estates, Burgundy ranked its vineyards, the individual plots of land where the grapes were grown. The system distinguished between everyday village-level wines, the better plots classified as first-level vineyards, and the very finest plots given the highest designation. This made a certain kind of sense, because in Burgundy, it is the land itself, the particular combination of soil and slope and exposure, that determines the quality of the wine. But it also created a peculiar complexity because a single top-ranked vineyard might be divided among 50 or more different owners, each making their own wine from their small piece, some excellent and some merely adequate. In the sparkling wine region, yet another system emerged, one that ranked not individual vineyards or estates but entire villages on a percentage scale. Villages given the highest rating supplied the most valued grapes, and growers there received the full price for their harvest. Those in lower-rated villages received proportionally less. Germany developed its own approach, ranking wines not by where they came from, but by how ripe the grapes were when they were picked. This system organized wines from the lightest and driest at one end to the sweetest and most concentrated at the other. It was a clever idea but had its own problems, because it implied that sweeter wine was always better, which many people would dispute. Each of these systems reflects the values and priorities of its region. The Bordeaux system prizes commerce and brand identity. The Burgundy system prizes the land itself. The German system prizes the raw material of the grape. Together, they form a patchwork of approaches to the same fundamental question, one that the wine world has been asking for centuries and has never fully answered. How do you define quality in a drink that is as much about feeling, memory, and place as it is about what is actually in the glass? And while the old wine-producing countries of Europe were busy classifying and ranking, something new was stirring on the other side of the world. In the autumn of 1861, a flamboyant Hungarian nobleman stepped off a ship in San Francisco Harbor, carrying the most ambitious cargo in the history of American agriculture. He had roughly 200,000 vine cuttings, representing some 1,400 different grape varieties, collected during a tour of the great wine regions of Europe. The California state legislature had sent him, hoping that the Golden State's warm, dry climate could support the noble vines of France, Germany, and beyond. His name was Agustin Harashthi, and the cuttings he carried across the ocean would form the genetic foundation of the California wine industry. He was not the first to grow European grapes in California. Missionaries had been cultivating a hardy, productive vine at their chain of coastal missions since 1769, making wine for religious services. The first winery in California was a mission church that produced wine as early as 1779. But the grape the missionaries grew made mediocre wine, and Harashthi was convinced that California could do far better. He founded a winery in Sonoma in 1857, still recognized today as the oldest premium winery in the state, and began planting his European imports with the zeal of a true believer. California's wine industry grew quickly in the decades that followed, fueled by the gold rush population boom, the arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the contributions of immigrant winemakers from Italy, Germany, and France. A Prussian immigrant established the first commercial winery in the Napa Valley in 1861. A Finnish sea captain founded another estate in 1879, modeling it on the great properties of Bordeaux. By the 1880s, Napa was home to dozens of wineries whose wines were beginning to attract attention beyond the state's borders. There is a part of this story that is too often left out. In the 1870s and 1880s, Chinese workers provided much of the essential labor that built the California wine industry. Many of them had been displaced from railroad construction after the transcontinental line was completed, and they cleared land, planted vines, dug caves, and built the stone cellars that still stand throughout the valleys of Napa and Sonoma. Their contributions have been largely erased from the official histories, but the industry could not have developed without them. On the other side of the Pacific, Australia was following a remarkably similar path. After an early collection of vine cuttings was imported in the 1830s, winemaking expanded steadily across the southeastern part of the country. The Hunter Valley north of Sydney, the Barossa Valley in South Australia, and the Yarra Valley near Melbourne became the foundational wine regions of the new nation. Australian wines even won prizes at European exhibitions as early as the 1870s, a hint of things to come, though few on either side of the world took much notice at the time. The German settlers who arrived in the Barossa in the 1840s brought with them not just vine cuttings but an entire culture of winemaking, knowledge passed down through generations of growing grapes along the rivers of Germany. They planted the varieties they knew best, and some of those original vines are still producing wine today. South Australia had a crucial advantage that would prove invaluable over the coming decades. It was isolated enough to escape the devastating insect plague that was destroying vineyards across Europe and Eastern Australia. Strict quarantine measures kept the pest out, and the old vine plantings of the Barossa survived untouched. Today, some of these vines, nearly 2 centuries old, are among the most precious treasures in the wine world. The new wine-producing countries faced a challenge that set them apart from Europe in a fundamental way. They had no tradition. European wine regions had centuries, sometimes thousands of years, of accumulated knowledge about which grapes grew best in which soils, which hillsides made the finest wine, which techniques worked and which did not. California and Australia had none of this. They had to build everything from scratch, through trial and error, through experimentation and the occasional happy accident. This absence of tradition turned out to be both a weakness and a remarkable strength. Without the weight of established practice, these new winemakers were free to try things that their European counterparts would never have considered. They could plant any grape variety anywhere, blend grapes from different regions, adopt new technologies without resistance from conservative local guilds, and market their wines in whatever way they found effective. They embraced stainless steel tanks, temperature control, drip irrigation, and mechanical harvesting long before most European producers would even think about such things. The result was a new style of winemaking, technically precise, reliably consistent, and increasingly appealing to a global market that valued fruit-forward flavors and approachable textures over the more austere, sometimes challenging styles of traditional European wine. This approach would come to be called, sometimes admiringly and sometimes with a touch of scorn, the New World style, a term that implied not just geography but a whole philosophy, an approach that put the winemaker's skill at the center of the story rather than the land itself. For centuries, the assumption had been absolute. Great wine could only come from Europe, from the ancient vineyards of France and Italy and Germany that had been producing wine since the days of the Roman Empire. The idea that a wine from California or Australia could equal the finest wines of the Old World was dismissed as a fantasy by the European establishment. That assumption was about to be shattered publicly and dramatically on a spring afternoon in Paris. But before we get to that extraordinary tasting, we need to visit the dark years when an entire country tried to stop its people from drinking wine altogether. On the evening of January the 16th, 1920, in churches and meeting halls across the United States, temperance activists gathered to celebrate what they believed was the dawn of a new and better world. At midnight, a new law would take effect, banning the making, selling, and transporting of alcoholic drinks throughout the nation. A famous preacher held a mock funeral for alcohol in Virginia, declaring to a cheering crowd that the slums would soon be a memory and that prisons would empty. After decades of campaigning, the temperance movement had achieved what many thought impossible. They had written sobriety into the highest law of the land. What followed was not the paradise they had promised, but 13 years of unintended consequences, creative evasion, and the near-total destruction of the American wine industry. Before the ban, the United States had a thriving wine culture centered in California, but reaching into New York, Ohio, Missouri, Virginia, and dozens of other states. California alone was home to more than 700 wineries. By the time the ban was lifted in 1933, more than 90% of them had closed for good. In some states, the wine industry was wiped out entirely, and it would take generations, in some cases nearly a century, to rebuild. The destruction was not quite as total as it might have been, thanks to a few clever loopholes in the law. The most important of these was an exception for wine used in religious ceremonies. Churches and synagogues were still permitted to use wine, and wineries that obtained special permits could continue producing it for this purpose. The result was predictable. Across the country, demand for religious wine suddenly increased far beyond what any plausible growth in religious observance could explain. One winery in the Napa Valley, run by a devout Catholic, survived the entire 13 years by making wine for the Catholic churches of San Francisco. A second loophole proved even more important. The law allowed each household to produce up to 200 gallons of what it called non-intoxicating fruit juice per year for personal use. The authorities generally interpreted this provision as permitting homemade wine, and the result was an explosion of winemaking in kitchens and basements across the country, particularly in Italian, Greek, and Jewish immigrant communities where wine was woven into the fabric of daily life. To serve this booming demand, California grape growers found a new market, selling fresh grapes directly to home winemakers across the country. The area planted with grapes in California actually increased during the ban, even as commercial wineries closed. But the grapes being planted were thick-skinned shipping varieties that could survive the long railroad journey to eastern cities, not the delicate wine grapes that California had been cultivating for decades. The quality of California's vineyards declined sharply. The most colorful survival strategy was a product that became one of the iconic artifacts of the era, a block of concentrated dried grape juice sold with a packet of yeast and a set of instructions that were, in truth, a winemaking recipe disguised as a warning label. The instructions read something like, after dissolving the block in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug in the cupboard for 21 days, because then it would turn into wine. Everyone understood exactly what these products were for, and they sold in enormous quantities. The damage went far beyond the closing of wineries. 13 years of enforced abstinence broke the connection between wine and everyday American life. An entire generation grew up without learning to appreciate wine as part of a meal, without developing the cultural understanding that Europeans absorbed as a matter of course. When the ban was finally lifted on December 5, 1933, Americans returned to drinking, but they returned mainly to beer and spirits, not wine. The sophisticated wine culture that had been developing before the ban had been replaced by a taste for sweet, fortified drinks and cheap-flavored products that bore little resemblance to the table wines of Europe. The recovery was painfully slow. Most of the winemakers who had possessed the knowledge and skill to produce quality wine had retired, died, or moved on during the 13 dry years. The vineyards that survived were planted with the wrong grapes. The equipment had deteriorated or been dismantled, and the market had changed. Americans emerging from the Great Depression had neither the money nor the desire to experiment with unfamiliar table wines. For decades after the ban was lifted, the American wine industry was dominated by a handful of large companies making cheap, sweet, fortified wines sold primarily to working-class customers. The few wineries that tried to make high-quality table wine struggled against a market that was largely indifferent to their efforts. A legendary winemaker of Russian origin at one Napa estate, a dedicated owner at another, and a small handful of others kept the flame alive, but they were voices in the wilderness. The turnaround did not truly begin until the 1960s, when a new generation of winemakers, many of them educated in wine science and inspired by their travels in Europe, began planting fine grape varieties, building modern wineries, and producing wines intended to compete with the best in the world. When one particular visionary built his winery in the Napa Valley in 1966, it was widely seen as the symbolic beginning of a new chapter for California wine. He believed passionately that his state could produce wines equal to the finest in France, and he backed that belief with money, hard work, and an irresistible force of personality. The 13 dry years remained the darkest chapter in the history of American wine, a story of how quickly a winemaking tradition can be destroyed and how painfully slowly it can be rebuilt. And just as American wine was finding its feet again, the vineyards of Europe faced a different kind of darkness as the armies of a totalitarian regime swept across the continent. In the autumn of 1940, shortly after German forces completed their occupation of France, a man arrived in the Champagne region with a title that would have been absurd in any other context. He was the wine leader, an official appointed by the regime to oversee the systematic seizure of the region's most precious product. He was not a soldier, but a wine merchant who had worked in the trade before the war, and he knew the producers, the cellars, and the bottles intimately. This combination of expertise and authority made him a formidable opponent for the people of Champagne, who faced the challenge of handing over enough wine to satisfy the occupiers without surrendering their most treasured reserves. Similar officials were installed in every major wine region of France in Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Rhône, and Alsace, each one tasked with identifying, cataloguing, and shipping the finest wines to Germany. One of the most powerful figures in the regime was a notorious collector who maintained an enormous personal cellar stocked with plundered French treasures. Over the course of the occupation, more than 2 million bottles of fine wine were seized from French cellars and sent east. The response of French winemakers ranged across the full spectrum of human behavior. Some cooperated, either out of necessity or because they saw an opportunity to profit. Others engaged in a quiet, persistent campaign of deception designed to protect their best wine while appearing to comply. The most famous acts of resistance were wonderfully creative. One Burgundy producer, whose family had been making wine for generations, built false walls inside the medieval cellars beneath an old hospital. Behind these freshly constructed stone walls, he hid his finest bottles. To prevent the German inspectors from noticing the new stonework, the family collected spiders and placed them on the walls, letting them spin webs that made the construction look as though it had been undisturbed for decades. Other producers walled up entire sections of their caves, creating hidden chambers accessible only through secret entrances. Wine cellars served purposes far more important than hiding bottles. The vast underground networks of tunnels beneath the sparkling wine region, some of them carved from chalk by the Romans centuries earlier and stretching for miles, became hiding places for weapons, meeting points for resistance groups, and shelter for fleeing families. During bombing raids, thousands of civilians took refuge in these deep, cool chambers protected by the earth above. Some producers found ingenious ways to send their worst wine to the occupiers while keeping the best hidden away. Workers in the sparkling wine houses deliberately mislabeled shipments, sending crates to the wrong cities, so that they would spend weeks traveling aimlessly around the railroad network before being returned. Others filled their official orders with their poorest product, keeping the finest bottles sealed behind false walls or buried under the soil of the vineyards themselves. The occupation devastated French wine production in ways that went beyond the direct seizure of bottles. The occupying forces took horses, labor, and the chemical sprays that vineyards needed to fight disease, making it extremely difficult to maintain the vines properly. Many vineyards were neglected or abandoned during the war years, their quality declining from lack of care. The darkest chapters of the occupation involved the persecution of Jewish wine merchants and vineyard owners. Some of the most famous estates in Bordeaux, owned by a renowned family, were confiscated under anti-Jewish laws. The wife of one estate owner was arrested and deported to a concentration camp, where she died in 1945. Jewish wine merchants across France lost their businesses, their properties, and in many cases their lives. The relationships between the occupiers and the winemakers were often more complicated than simple stories of heroes and villains would suggest. The officials appointed to oversee the wine regions were sometimes wine lovers themselves, genuinely appreciative of what they were taking and occasionally willing to intervene on behalf of individual producers. Many French winemakers cooperated not out of sympathy, but out of calculated self-preservation, knowing that open defiance would result in the loss of everything they had. The moral boundaries blurred, and the memory of those blurred lines kept many families silent about their wartime experiences for decades. When the liberation came in 1944, the recovery was slow and painful. Vineyards that had been neglected for 4 years had to be nursed back to health. Equipment had to be replaced. Markets had to be rebuilt. The psychological wounds lingered long after the guns fell silent. The aftermath also brought the discovery of enormous collections of wine that the regime had assembled. When the liberating forces captured the retreats of the most powerful leaders, they found cellars containing hundreds of thousands of bottles of the finest French wine, a concentrated treasure representing some of the greatest years ever produced. Much of this wine was eventually returned to France, though the process was complicated and incomplete. The story of wine during the Second World War is, in the end, a story about what people will do to protect the things they love and what others will do to take them away. The occupiers and their systematic looting represented the dark side of wine's prestige, the way that its cultural value made it a target. The winemakers who hid their best bottles behind false walls, who mislabeled shipments and collected spiders to spin webs over fresh construction, represented something different. A stubborn, creative refusal to let go of a tradition that was older than any army or regime. When the war ended, the vines were still there, rooted in the same soil, waiting to produce another year's wine. And in the decades that followed, something happened that would shake the wine world to its foundations, not with weapons but with wine glasses, in a small room in the city of Paris. On May the 24th, 1976, in a small room at a hotel in Paris, 9 of the most respected wine experts in France sat down to taste 20 wines in a blind tasting. The bottles were wrapped in brown paper bags, their identities concealed. The event had been organized by a young English wine merchant who ran a shop and a tasting school on a fashionable street near the center of the city. His idea had been simple, even playful. To celebrate the 200th birthday of the United States, he would pit a selection of California wines against some of the greatest wines of France, offering a friendly comparison that he fully expected would confirm the superiority of the French classics. He had invited the French press, but only a single journalist showed up, an American reporter based in Paris who was looking for a light feature story. It was a good thing he came. What happened in that room over the next few hours became the most famous wine tasting in history. The judges were beyond reproach. They included the co-owner of what is widely considered the greatest wine estate in the world, the editor of France's most influential wine publication, and the chef of a restaurant honored with the highest possible rating. These were people whose palates had been shaped by decades of tasting the finest wines ever made. In the white wine round, the judges tasted French and Californian wines side by side. When the scores were added up and the bags were removed, the wine in first place was not from Burgundy, as everyone had expected. It was from the Napa Valley, made by a winemaker who had been born in Croatia. The French judges were visibly shaken. Some demanded to see the scoring sheets, certain that an error had been made. The red wine round was even more dramatic. The judges compared legendary French estates against Californian wines that were virtually unknown outside of a small valley in Northern California. When the results were revealed, first place went to a wine from a tiny estate in the Napa Valley, owned by a former university lecturer. This wine, from a property that had been in operation for barely 3 years, had beaten some of the most celebrated wines in the world. Wines that cost many times more and had centuries of reputation behind them, all in a tasting judged entirely by French experts. The reaction in France was a storm of disbelief, denial, and anger. Some of the judges immediately tried to take back their scores. The editor of the wine publication reportedly demanded the return of her scoring sheet. Others insisted that the tasting had been rigged, though no one ever produced any evidence of anything improper. In the United States, the reaction was pure joy. The American Reporter's article, published under a headline that borrowed the name of a famous Greek myth about divine judgment, transformed what might have been a forgettable afternoon into an event of global significance. The idea that unknown California wines could beat the greatest wines of France in a blind tasting conducted by French experts on French soil was a story the world could not resist. It was a perfect underdog tale. Can you imagine what it must have felt like in those quiet valleys of California? For years, a handful of dedicated winemakers had been laboring in relative obscurity, convinced that their land and their grapes could produce something extraordinary. And now, in a single afternoon, they had been proven right, not by their own judgment, but by the judgment of the very people who had the most reason to disagree. The impact on the global wine industry was enormous and lasting. Before that afternoon in Paris, the wine world had a clear and unquestioned hierarchy. Great wine came from France, Italy, and Germany. Everything else was a lesser product. After 1976, that hierarchy was broken. If California could produce wines that beat the best of France, then perhaps Australia could too, or Chile, or Argentina, or New Zealand, or South Africa. The tasting did not merely elevate California, it opened the door for every wine-producing country on Earth to compete on equal terms with the Old World. The commercial consequences were immediate. Land prices in the Napa Valley soared. Investment poured in from around the world. The winning estates became international celebrities, their wines commanding prices that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Within a decade, the Napa Valley had been transformed from a quiet farming region into one of the most prestigious wine addresses on the planet. The English merchant who organized the tasting found himself quietly frozen out by much of the French wine establishment, which never entirely forgave him for arranging the event that had embarrassed the nation. His relationships with many French producers were permanently damaged. 30 years later, in 2006, a rematch was organized using the same wines, now 3 decades old. Once again, a blind tasting by expert judges. Once again, a California wine took first place in the red category, confirming that these wines could not only compete in their youth, but could age just as gracefully as their French rivals. That afternoon in Paris remains a turning point in the history of wine, the precise moment when the assumption of European superiority was publicly and permanently challenged. It did not prove that California wines were better than French wines. The complexity of taste makes such absolute judgments meaningless. What it proved was that they could be just as good, that quality in wine depends on skill, dedication, and the potential of the land, not on geography or tradition alone. That idea, once demonstrated, could never be put back in the bottle. And in the wake of that tasting, a single individual would emerge who would reshape the wine world not with grapes or barrels, but with a scoring system and a newsletter published from his basement. In the late 1970s, a young lawyer from Baltimore, Maryland, did something that would transform the wine world more profoundly than any technology, any law, or any trend of the 20th century. Frustrated by what he saw as a wine criticism establishment riddled with conflicts of interest, critics who accepted gifts and free trips from the same producers whose wines they reviewed, whose reviews were so vague as to be useless, he decided to start his own publication. Working from his basement, with his wife handling the typing, he launched a newsletter in 1978 that would eventually become the most powerful publication in the history of wine. His most consequential decision was deceptively simple. He would rate every wine on a 100-point scale. The system adapted the familiar American grading system, where 50 was failing and 100 was perfect, to the evaluation of wine. Every bottle he reviewed received a single number that anyone could understand at a glance. A wine that scored 90 was excellent. A wine that scored 75 was mediocre. A wine that scored 96 was something worth seeking out at any cost. The simplicity was the point. You did not need to decode the flowery, subjective language of traditional wine writing. You had a number and you knew where you stood. His timing was perfect. The famous tasting in Paris had just shattered the assumption that great wine was exclusively European, and a new generation of American consumers was discovering wine for the first time. These were people who did not have the cultural background to navigate the complexities of French regions, German wine laws, or Italian classification systems. They wanted someone to tell them clearly and with authority what was worth buying. This man became that someone. His palate had distinctive preferences that would prove enormously influential. He favored wines with intense concentrated fruit, generous use of oak in the aging process, and a ripe, full-bodied character. He was less enthusiastic about austere, sharp, or tightly wound wines that needed years in the cellar to open up and show their best. His preferences aligned naturally with the styles emerging from warm, sunny regions like California and parts of southern France, where ripe fruit and plush texture came easily. The market power of his scores was extraordinary. A single number could determine whether a wine sold out overnight or sat unsold on shelves for months. In Bordeaux, where producers sold their wines while they were still aging in barrels, based largely on critical assessments, his score for a New Year's production could move millions of dollars in a single afternoon. A score of 95 or above could triple a wine's price. A score below 85 could be devastating. Shops began posting his numbers on their shelf cards, and customers made their purchasing decisions based on a single score from a single critic. The phenomenon was given a name by his detractors, a term that described what they saw as the homogenizing effect of his influence on wine around the world. The argument went like this. Winemakers everywhere, chasing his approval and the enormous financial rewards it brought, began making their wines in the style he preferred, darker, richer, more concentrated with more oak flavor and more ripe fruit. Regional differences, the critics argued, were being flattened as producers from Burgundy to Barossa all aimed for the same high score from the same palate. Traditional winemakers accused him of rewarding power over elegance, intensity over subtlety, and technical polish over honest expression of place. He denied the charge vigorously. He insisted that his high scores went to wines from every region and tradition, not just to the big, bold wines. He pointed to his love of wines from the Rhone Valley, from Burgundy, and from regions that made wine in a lighter, more restrained style. But the perception persisted, and the term coined by his critics became shorthand for a broader worry about whether scores and ratings were pushing an entire industry towards sameness. His influence extended beyond the numbers. His writing style, direct, confident, full of vivid sensory descriptions and strong opinions, set a new standard for wine criticism. He was not afraid to criticize famous estates or beloved years when he felt they fell short. His financial independence was genuine and carefully maintained. His publication never accepted advertising, and he paid for every bottle he reviewed. This combination of strong opinions, transparent methods, and freedom from commercial pressure gave him a credibility that no previous wine critic had ever possessed. His success inspired a flood of imitators. Wine magazines, websites, and independent critics multiplied, each offering their own scores and opinions. The 100-point scale, initially his personal invention, was adopted across the entire industry. Even critics who disagreed with his preferences found themselves using his system because consumers had been trained to understand it. He stepped back from active reviewing around 2019, and his retirement prompted a wave of reflection on what he had meant to the wine world. Had he made wine accessible to millions of people who would otherwise have found it bewildering and intimidating? Or had he distorted an entire industry, bending it toward the preferences of one palate? The answer is probably both. His scoring system opened doors for countless consumers who might never have felt confident walking into a wine shop. It also reduced the infinite complexity of a great wine, its history, its connection to the land, its evolving character over years, to a two-digit number on a shelf card. What is beyond dispute is that no single person has ever wielded more power over the global wine market. A lawyer from Maryland, armed with nothing more than his palate and his conviction that wine writing should serve the person buying the bottle rather than the person making it, reshaped an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And while his scores were shaping the market, the quieter technologies of wine, the bark of a tree, the wood of a barrel, the glass of a bottle, were writing their own long and quietly remarkable history. In the cork oak forests of southern Portugal, every 9 to 12 years, a quiet ritual unfolds that connects the modern wine industry to a practice thousands of years old. Teams of skilled workers approach the ancient trees, some of them over 200 years old, and carefully strip the thick, spongy bark from their trunks using specialized axes. They work with a precision that ensures the tree is not harmed and will regrow its bark for the next harvest. Portugal produces roughly 70% of the world's cork supply, and these forests are not only the foundation of a vast industry, but also vital ecosystems home to rare and endangered animals. The piece of bark that seals a bottle of wine is, in its own quiet way, one of the most remarkable natural materials on Earth. Cork was first used to seal wine containers by the ancient Greeks and Romans, who plugged their clay storage vessels with cork as well as wax and resin. But cork fell out of widespread use after the fall of Rome, and for most of the medieval period, wine was stored in barrels and drunk within a year or two of being made. The return of cork to prominence came in the 1600s, when something else arrived that would change everything: the glass wine bottle. The glass bottle as we know it did not come from France but from England. English glassmakers, using furnaces that burned hotter than those on the continent, produced a stronger, darker glass that could withstand the pressure of sparkling wines and the rough handling of transportation. The earliest known glass wine bottles date from the 1630s, and they were squat, round-bottomed vessels, more like flasks, that stood upright in cellars and were sealed with oiled rags or wooden plugs. The marriage of the glass bottle and the cork stopper transformed wine. Cork has a unique structure, millions of tiny air-filled chambers packed into every small piece, making it soft enough to be pushed into the neck of a bottle, springy enough to create a tight seal, and chemically neutral enough not to spoil the taste of the wine. And cork does one more thing that is quietly wonderful. It allows a tiny, almost immeasurable amount of air to pass through over the course of years, just enough to allow the slow, complex changes that let wine develop and mature in the bottle. The shape of the wine bottle evolved gradually during the 1700s. The early squat bottles gave way to taller, more slender ones that could be laid on their side. This seemingly small change had enormous consequences. When a bottle lies on its side, the wine stays in contact with the cork, keeping it moist and swollen, and preventing it from drying out and letting air in. For the first time, wine could age in a sealed bottle for years or decades, growing more complex and beautiful with time. The great aged wines that define our modern idea of fine wine, mature Bordeaux, old Burgundy, vintage port, exist only because of the combination of a strong glass bottle, a reliable cork, and the practice of storing bottles on their sides. Let us turn now to the third great technology of wine, the oak barrel. The Romans transported their wine in clay jars and encountered the wooden barrel when they expanded into Gaul, the region we now call France. The Gauls, who were gifted woodworkers, had been using wooden barrels for beer and other liquids, and the Romans quickly recognized the advantages. Wood was lighter than clay, more durable, easier to transport, and could be rolled rather than carried. By the 3rd century, the barrel had largely replaced clay throughout the Roman world. Not all wood is equal when it comes to wine. Over centuries of experimentation, European winemakers discovered that oak was the ideal material. Its tight grain prevented leaks while allowing just a whisper of air to reach the wine, similar to what cork does in a bottle. And oak contributed something else: flavor. The wood releases compounds as wine rests inside it, adding notes of vanilla, spice, and warmth that can enrich and deepen the character of the wine. Different types of oak from different forests give different effects. Oak from certain French forests tends to give elegant, subtle flavors. American oak, which is a different species, tends to give bolder, more assertive notes. The 20th century brought a challenge to all 3 of these traditional materials. A problem had long plagued wine sealed with cork, a musty, cardboard-like taste caused by a chemical that could form when naturally occurring molds in the cork interacted with certain cleaning agents. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 2 and 7 bottles out of every 100 might be affected. For every case of wine you bought, there was a reasonable chance that at least 1 bottle would be spoiled. The search for alternatives sparked one of the most heated debates in modern wine. A screw cap designed specifically for wine was developed in the late 1950s, and Australian wineries began experimenting with it in the 1970s. But the resistance was fierce. The screw cap was associated with cheap wine, and the ritual of pulling a cork was so deeply embedded in wine culture that many people simply refused to accept a substitute, no matter how well it worked. The breakthrough came in the early 2000s, when a group of producers in Australia collectively adopted screw caps for their wines, followed by a coalition of wineries in New Zealand. Today, roughly 90% of New Zealand wine is sealed with a screw cap. Scientific studies, including tastings that stretched over 10 years, consistently showed that wines aged under screw cap developed just as well as, or better than, those under cork. The traditional cork industry responded by investing heavily in quality control, and the rate of spoiled bottles has dropped significantly. The debate continues, though, with less heat than before. Is the seal on a wine bottle a purely practical choice? Or is it part of the experience, carrying cultural and emotional meaning that goes beyond engineering? It is a question that touches on something fundamental about wine, the tension between tradition and progress, between the way things have always been done and the way they might be done better. And speaking of that tension, let us turn now to the idea at the very heart of wine, the most debated and most beautiful concept in the entire world of winemaking. Walk into any serious wine bar in Paris or Melbourne or San Francisco, and sooner or later someone at the table will use a word that has no good translation into English, no precise scientific definition, and no universally agreed upon meaning, and yet is considered the single most important concept in the entire world of wine. That word is terroir. It comes from the French word for earth, and it refers approximately to the idea that a wine carries within it the unique character of the place where its grapes were grown. But terroir is not simply about soil, though soil is part of it. It is not simply about climate, though climate matters deeply. It is about the whole of a place, the particular way that the rock beneath the surface, the angle of the slope, the direction the vines face, the tiny variations in temperature and moisture, and the traditions of the people who tend them all come together to produce wine that tastes like nowhere else on earth. The idea has ancient roots. The Greeks noticed that wine from one island tasted different from wine from another, and they priced their wines accordingly. The Romans went further, identifying particular hillsides and soil types as producing the finest wines. But it was the Cistercian monks of Burgundy, as we explored earlier in our story, who turned this observation into a system, spending centuries mapping their vineyards and recording which plots consistently made the best wine. The modern scientific debate over terroir is fierce, and it shows no signs of being resolved anytime soon. On one side are those who believe that great wine is fundamentally an expression of the land, that the winemaker's role is to step aside and let the vineyard speak. On the other side are those who argue that terroir is, at best, a romantic idea, and at worst, a marketing tool, that the character of a wine depends far more on decisions made in the cellar, how the grapes are pressed, what temperature the juice ferments at, how long the wine spends in oak, than on anything to do with the dirt where the vines grow. The scientific evidence is genuinely mixed. Research has shown that soil type does affect how vines behave. Vines growing in thin, well-drained stony soil tend to produce smaller, more concentrated grapes than those growing in rich, fertile earth. The amount of water available to the roots, the temperature of the soil, and its mineral content all influence how the vine grows and what ends up in the grape. The idea of vine stress is particularly important here. A vine that has to work hard, pushing its roots deep through rocky ground to find water, tends to produce more interesting fruit than a vine that is pampered and comfortable. But there is a popular notion that you can taste the actual minerals of the soil in the wine, that a wine grown on limestone somehow tastes of limestone, or that a wine grown on slate tastes of slate. This idea, lovely as it is, has been largely set aside by scientific research. Plants do not absorb minerals from the soil in a form that the human tongue can detect. The mineral-like flavors that people taste in wine come from chemical reactions during fermentation and aging, not from ground-up rocks passing through vine roots. What the soil does contribute is indirect, but real. It shapes the vine's behavior, the balance of the fruit, and ultimately the character of the wine. There is another dimension of terroir that scientists are only beginning to understand. Every vineyard is home to a unique population of microscopic organisms on the grape skins, in the soil, on the surfaces of the winery itself. These tiny creatures contribute to the character of the wine made there, and this invisible community of life may be as important as the geology in creating the distinctive flavors of a particular place. A winemaker who allows these native organisms to carry out the fermentation rather than using a laboratory-grown strain is in a sense incorporating another layer of place into the wine. The debate over terroir has serious commercial and political consequences. The entire system of protected wine names, the French system and its equivalents around the world, is built on the premise that terroir is real, that wines from specific places have characters worth protecting through law. If terroir is merely a story people tell, then the entire structure of geographic wine regulation becomes a very elaborate fiction. For a long time, many winemakers in the newer wine-producing countries dismissed terroir as European mysticism. They argued that the quality of wine depended on the skill of the person making it and the quality of the grapes, not on the particular patch of ground where those grapes happened to grow. American winemakers in particular emphasized craft over place, producing excellent wines by blending grapes from large areas rather than focusing on specific plots. But in recent decades, the wheel has turned. Many of these same producers have come to embrace the idea of terroir, recognizing that their best wines come from specific sites with distinctive characters. In California, hundreds of officially recognized wine-growing areas reflect a growing appreciation for how place shapes wine. In Australia, the concept of regionality has become central to the marketing of fine wine. Even producers who once prided themselves on their ability to make great wine from any raw material now highlight the specific vineyard origins of their finest bottles. Terroir remains the most debated, most misunderstood, and most important idea in the world of wine. It is, at the same time, a scientific question, a philosophical statement, a marketing strategy, and an article of faith. It resists easy definition because it describes something genuinely complex, the interplay of countless natural and human factors that combine to make wine from one hillside taste different from wine grown a stone's throw away. Whether that difference is rooted in geology, in tiny living organisms, in climate, in tradition, or in some combination of all of these, it is undeniably real. People who taste wines from neighboring plots can tell them apart. That difference is the heart of wine culture. And from this most contested of ideas, we turn now to the system that was built upon it, the laws and borders that determine what a wine can call itself. In the closing years of the 1800s, as the great vine-killing epidemic was devastating the vineyards of France and the supply of genuine French wine had dwindled to a trickle, a different kind of crisis was brewing. With real Bordeaux and Burgundy in desperately short supply, unscrupulous merchants saw an opportunity. Sugar water doctored with chemicals was bottled and sold as Bordeaux. Cheap wine shipped in bulk from North Africa was relabeled as Burgundy. Drinks made from raisins were passed off as fine French wine. The fraud was everywhere, brazen and hugely profitable, and it threatened to destroy the reputation of French wine, the country's most valuable agricultural export. Something had to be done, and what France created in response would become one of the most influential regulatory systems in the history of food and drink. The system did not appear all at once. It evolved through decades of lawmaking, court battles, and political argument, beginning with an early French law in 1889 that attempted to set basic standards for what could be called wine. The work continued through the early 20th century, gathering force as fraud became more widespread and consumers grew more vocal in their demands for honest labels. The formal structure was established in 1935, when France created a national body charged with defining, protecting, and enforcing the rules for its wine regions. The idea at the heart of this system was revolutionary. For the first time, a government declared that the name of a place carried genuine value, that the word Bordeaux or Champagne or Burgundy was not merely a description of where a wine came from, but a promise of quality, method, and character that deserved protection under law. The system established strict rules for every aspect of production within each protected region: which grape varieties could be planted, how the vines must be pruned, how much fruit each vine was allowed to produce, and how the wine must be made. Only wines that met every one of these requirements could carry the protected name on their label. Italy followed France's lead in 1963 with its own system. Spain created a similar structure. Portugal, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and other European wine countries developed their own versions. Each reflected the priorities of its own region. The French system was detailed and strict, specifying nearly everything. The Italian system was initially more relaxed, but was later tightened with the addition of a higher tier for wines considered to have reached the very top level of quality. The Appellation System has not been without its rebels. The most dramatic rebellion came from Italy, where a group of innovative winemakers in Tuscany found themselves trapped by regulations they felt were stifling rather than protecting quality. The rules for the region's most famous red wine required the inclusion of white grapes in the blend, a requirement that the best producers believed was actively making their wine worse. When they began making wines with different grapes, aging them in small French oak barrels rather than the large traditional casks, they discovered that their wines, which would eventually be recognized as among the finest in the world, could not qualify for any existing protected designation. Under the law, these extraordinary bottles were classified at the very lowest level as simple table wine. The irony was delicious. Wines that were being praised by critics and commanding high prices were officially ranked alongside the cheapest wine on the supermarket shelf. A new term was coined to describe them, and their success posed a deep challenge to the entire system. The regulations were designed to protect tradition and guarantee authenticity, but in this case they were penalizing innovation and excellence. Italy eventually created new categories to accommodate wines that did not fit the old rules, but the episode remains a reminder that quality does not always respect the boundaries drawn by regulators. The most aggressive defense of a protected wine name has been waged by the guardians of the sparkling wine from northeastern France. A special organization founded in 1941 has spent decades and millions of dollars protecting the name from unauthorized use anywhere in the world. The legal protection dates all the way back to the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which included provisions preventing the defeated nations from using French wine names. French courts had ruled against the misuse of the name even earlier in the 1840s. The enforcement has been remarkably thorough. Legal action has been taken against companies using the name for everything from sparkling water to flooring. A famous fashion house was forced to rename a perfume and pay compensation. A small Swiss village that had been making wine under the same name for over 300 years was pressured into giving it up. In the United States, a legal loophole allows a few American producers who were already using the name before a 2006 trade agreement to continue doing so, a situation that remains a source of deep frustration in northeastern France. The system of protected wine names, for all its imperfections, has achieved something genuinely important. It has established the principle that place matters, that the name on a label carries meaning beyond simple geography, and that this meaning is worth defending. The system has been criticized for being too rigid, too political, and too easily captured by powerful interests. But it has also preserved regional diversity, protected consumers from fraud, and maintained the ancient connection between wine and the land it comes from. In a world where the forces of trade tend to flatten differences and make everything taste the same, the appellation system stands as a quiet insistence that a wine from one place is not the same as a wine from another, and that the difference is worth preserving. And from the laws and borders that define wine, let us turn now to a part of the story that has been overlooked for far too long: the women who have shaped the history of wine from its very beginnings. In one of the oldest stories ever written, composed roughly 4,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia, the hero of the tale meets a remarkable figure at the edge of the world. She is a goddess of wine and hospitality, and she keeps a tavern by the sea. She offers the hero counsel that ranks among the oldest philosophical advice ever recorded, urging him to enjoy the pleasures of life, food, drink, clean clothes, the love of family, rather than chase the impossible dream of living forever. She is not a minor character in the story. She is one of the wisest figures the hero encounters, and her domain, wine, and the welcoming of strangers is presented as a source of deep wisdom. This divine tavern keeper is almost certainly a reflection of real women in the ancient world, because in early Mesopotamia, brewing and tavern keeping were overwhelmingly female occupations. And the connection between women and fermented drinks stretches even further back than that. Many historians believe that wine was most likely first discovered by a woman, since the preparation and storage of food, the activities most likely to lead to accidental fermentation, were primarily women's work in ancient societies. The oldest known wine deity in the ancient world was a goddess. In Egypt, another goddess was associated with wine and joyful celebration. In ancient Rome, the woman of the household oversaw the making and storing of wine as part of her daily responsibility. And yet, despite women's central role in the earliest chapters of wine's story, they were gradually and systematically pushed to the margins as wine became more formalized, more commercial, and more dominated by men. In ancient Rome, there are accounts, likely more wishful thinking than reality, of women being forbidden from drinking wine altogether. In medieval Europe, the monasteries that preserved and advanced the art of winemaking were exclusively male institutions. The nuns who lived in parallel communities rarely had the same access to the vineyards and cellars where the real work of wine was done. The exclusion became even more concrete as the wine industry professionalized over the centuries. For a long time, women were barred from entering wine cellars during the production process, based on an old superstition that a woman's presence could spoil the wine aging in the barrels. This belief persisted in some regions well into the 20th century, and it effectively kept women out of the most important part of winemaking. Women could work in the vineyard, picking grapes under the sun, pulling weeds, tying vines to their supports. But the cellar, where grape juice became wine, was a place for men. There were, of course, extraordinary exceptions. We have already met the young widow who took control of a struggling sparkling wine business in 1805 and transformed it into one of the most celebrated names in the history of wine. But she was not alone. Another widow took charge of a different sparkling wine house after her husband's death in 1858 and pioneered the dry style that is now the standard. She insisted on quality over volume at a time when the market rewarded sweetness. Yet another woman ran a major house through the years of the German occupation, maintaining its reputation and earning the loyalty of one of the most famous leaders of the Allied cause, who declared her wine his drink of choice. In the great wine region of Bordeaux, a member of one of the most distinguished families in wine took over the management of a legendary estate after her father's death and continued the family's tradition of commissioning famous artists to design the label, keeping the property among the finest in the world until her own death. The modern era has seen a gradual but significant opening of the wine world to women, though the progress has been uneven and the work is far from complete. In the United States, the first woman to earn a formal degree in wine science from the most important wine school in California did so in 1965, which gives you a sense of how recently women were excluded from the very education that the industry demanded. By the 1970s, the first women were being hired as winemakers at major estates. In the decades that followed, women rose to the highest levels of the profession, demonstrating beyond any reasonable doubt that gender had nothing to do with the ability to make extraordinary wine. In France, the path was often harder. The established wine regions were deeply conservative, and the old hierarchies resisted change more stubbornly than the more open-minded new wine countries. But women gained ground steadily, and by the early 21st century, female winemakers and estate owners were no longer curiosities. One woman co-managed what is widely considered the greatest wine estate in the world and later founded her own property, earning a reputation for uncompromising standards. The rise of women in wine has extended well beyond the cellar. In wine writing and criticism, women have reached the highest levels of influence and respect. One British writer became one of the most trusted voices in wine, producing reference works that became the standard texts of the industry. In the world of restaurants, women have risen to prominence as sommeliers, the professionals who guide diners through the wine list, though a study found that women still made up less than a quarter of sommeliers at top restaurants as recently as the late 2010s. The gender revolution in wine is not complete. Women remain underrepresented in the senior positions of the industry, face gaps in pay, and navigate a culture whose vocabulary still leans heavily on masculine imagery, wines described as big, powerful, muscular. But the direction of change is clear, and it is happening faster with each passing year. The ancient goddess of wine, offering wisdom and hospitality at the edge of the world 4,000 years ago, would perhaps recognize something of herself in the women who are reshaping the modern wine world. The same combination of skill, knowledge, and quiet determination exercised in an industry that has only recently begun to acknowledge how much it owes to them. And now let us turn our gaze southward, below the equator, where the wines of the southern hemisphere were about to announce themselves to the world. In 1994, a French vine expert was examining grapevines in Chile when he noticed something peculiar. The grape that Chilean winemakers had been calling Merlot for more than 100 years did not look quite right. The leaf shape was subtly wrong. The grape clusters had a distinctive form. Laboratory analysis confirmed what his trained eye suspected. What Chile had been growing, making wine from, and selling as one variety for generations was in fact something else entirely, a Bordeaux grape that had been widely planted in France before the great vine-killing epidemic but had been considered extinct for over a century. Chile, without knowing it, had been preserving a piece of living history that Europe had lost. The rediscovery is one of the most remarkable stories in modern wine, and it captures something essential about the way wine went truly global in the late 20th century. Traditions transplanted from Europe, often by accident, took root in new landscapes and new climates and produced something that nobody had planned, but that turned out to be wonderful. Chile's wine industry had been quietly developing since the 1500s when missionaries planted the first vines near Santiago. But the real transformation came in the 1850s when wealthy Chilean landowners, inspired by their travels in France, began importing French grape varieties and planting them in the fertile Central Valley. Chile's geography is extraordinary for a wine country. The Andes stand like a wall to the east, the Pacific stretches to the west, the driest desert on Earth lies to the north, and Antarctic ice to the south. This natural fortress kept the devastating vine-killing insect out entirely. Chilean vines grow on their own roots to this day, ungrafted, a living link to a time before the epidemic changed everything. Across the Andes, Argentina's wine story is built around a single grape and the Frenchman who brought it there. He arrived in the city of Mendoza in 1853, fleeing political upheaval in France, and he carried vine cuttings with him, including a variety that had never achieved the highest status in its homeland. But in the high-altitude vineyards of Mendoza, at elevations that would make European grape growers nervous, this grape found a home that suited it better than anywhere in France. The intense sunshine, the cool nights, and the dry mountain air produced wines of extraordinary color and richness, a style entirely different from what the same grape made in its country of origin. The man who carried those cuttings founded Argentina's first agricultural school and nursery, and his legacy is now celebrated with an international holiday every April. South Africa's wine industry had a more troubled modern history. Under the system of racial separation that governed the country from 1948 to 1994, the wine industry was isolated from international markets by trade restrictions and cultural boycotts. A powerful, cooperative, controlled production, pricing, and exports, leaving little room for competition or innovation. Farm workers, the vast majority of whom were people of color, labored under deeply unfair conditions. One particularly cruel practice involved paying workers partly in cheap wine, which contributed to widespread alcohol dependency in farming communities. South Africa did produce one genuinely original contribution to wine during this period, a new grape variety created at a university in 1925 by crossing two existing types. This grape is the only commercially significant variety unique to South Africa, and it has become the country's signature wine, though its early versions were often criticized for harsh flavors. The end of the racial separation system in 1994 transformed the industry almost overnight. International markets opened, investment flowed in, and a new generation of winemakers gained access to education, technology, and connections that had been denied during the years of isolation. Progress toward a more equitable industry has been real but slow. The ownership of vineyards and wineries remains heavily skewed, and the legacy of centuries of exploitation does not disappear quickly. New Zealand's wine revolution is the most recent and in some ways the most dramatic story in the Southern Hemisphere. Modern winemaking there effectively began in 1973, when a company planted the first vines of a particular white grape variety in a region at the northern tip of the South Island. The first commercial vintage came in 1979, and it immediately turned heads. The wine had an intensely aromatic, herbaceous character that was completely unlike anything the same grape produced in its French homeland. The breakthrough came in 1985, when a new winery released a wine that received international praise and launched one of the most successful wine brands in the world. Within a decade, the region had become one of the most planted in the Southern Hemisphere, and this single grape variety came to account for more than 85% of New Zealand's wine exports. A country that had barely made wine a generation earlier had staked its claim to producing one of the world's most recognizable wine styles. The Southern Hemisphere wine revolution challenged the old order in ways that go far beyond competition. These are countries that came to wine relatively recently, without the weight of centuries of tradition, and their approach has been refreshingly direct, practical, and unafraid of new ideas. They have embraced technology and marketing with an enthusiasm that the traditional European establishment has sometimes found unsettling. But they have also developed authentic wine cultures of their own, ways of enjoying wine that are rooted in their own food, their own landscapes, and their own way of life, not borrowed from Europe. The vines may have crossed the ocean from the Old World, but the wines they produce belong entirely to the places where they now grow. And the vine's journey was not finished. It was about to take root in some of the most unexpected places on Earth. In the dusty town of Turpan, in the far western reaches of China, grapevines have been growing for at least 2,000 years. This low-lying desert basin, one of the hottest places on Earth, sits along the ancient Silk Road, and the evidence of grape cultivation here stretches back to the Han dynasty, more than 2 centuries before the Common Era. But the grapes of Turpan were eaten fresh or dried into raisins. The making of wine from grapes in the way that Europeans understood it was a practice that came and went in Chinese history without ever putting down deep roots. China's traditional fermented drinks were made from rice and millet, and for most of the country's long history, wine from grapes remained a curiosity from foreign lands rather than a native tradition. That began to change in the late 1800s, when a Chinese official founded what is generally considered the first modern winery in the country, in a coastal city in Shandong province, in 1892. He imported more than 100 grape varieties from Europe and hired a European winemaker to oversee the production. The company he founded survived revolution, civil war, foreign occupation, and every other upheaval of the 20th century, and it remains one of the largest wine companies in Asia today. But it was the economic opening of the 1980s and 90s that truly launched the Chinese wine industry. As the country opened to foreign investment and its middle class expanded, wine consumption began to rise from almost nothing. The numbers are staggering. The area planted with grapes increased more than 50-fold between the middle of the 20th century and the end of it. International wine companies established partnerships with Chinese firms, bringing expertise and investment to a rapidly growing market. Perhaps the most ambitious project is a collaboration between a French luxury company and local farmers in the Himalayan foothills of Yunnan province, where vineyards planted at extraordinary elevations, more than 2,500 meters above sea level, are tended by farmers from ethnic minority communities. The wines have attracted serious international attention, a remarkable convergence of French craft and Chinese agriculture in one of the most remote wine regions on Earth. The way wine is consumed in China carries its own cultural character. Wine is often served at formal banquets and business dinners, where it functions as much as a symbol of status as a source of sensory pleasure. Red wine is particularly popular, partly because the color red holds deep significance in Chinese culture, associated with prosperity and good fortune. The practice of mixing red wine with a sweet carbonated drink, which purists from other countries find baffling, is common at Chinese gatherings and reflects a practical approach to a beverage that many consumers find too strong or bitter on its own. Across the sea in Japan, the wine culture could not be more different. Japanese winemaking is small in scale, obsessively precise, and deeply attuned to the relationship between wine and food. At the center of the story is a particular pink-skinned grape that arrived in Japan from China via the Silk Road roughly 1,000 years ago. It was grown as a table grape for most of its history, and its use for winemaking did not begin until the 1870s, during a period of intense interest in Western technology and culture. The wines made from this grape are delicate, restrained, and beautifully suited to Japanese cooking, with its emphasis on subtle flavors, fresh ingredients, and seasonal awareness. They have won awards at international competitions and attracted the attention of wine professionals who appreciate their quiet versatility. Japanese winemakers bring to their craft the same meticulous attention to detail that characterizes Japanese work in other fields, and the result is a wine culture that values harmony and precision above all else. India's wine industry is younger and more dynamic than its Asian neighbors. Modern Indian winemaking effectively began in the 1980s, when an entrepreneur who had studied abroad founded a winery in a region of Western India, about 180 kilometers from Mumbai. Situated on a high plateau, the area turned out to have conditions surprisingly well suited to growing grapes, warm days, cool nights, and a reliable rainy season. The first wines were released around the year 2000, and the company has since grown into the largest wine producer in a country of more than 1 billion people. The challenges facing Indian wine are considerable. The climate is hot and humid, demanding careful management to prevent disease. The market is dominated by spirits and beer, and wine remains a niche product enjoyed mainly by affluent city dwellers in a few major urban centers. Import taxes on foreign wines are among the highest in the world, and the regulatory landscape for alcohol can shift suddenly and unpredictably. Beyond these 3 countries, wine is emerging in some truly unexpected corners of Asia. Small but growing wine industries exist in Thailand, Myanmar, and Vietnam, where tropical conditions demand innovative techniques and produce wines that are unlike anything made in the traditional wine-growing regions of the world. These ventures face extraordinary challenges, but they represent the latest chapter in wine's 8,000-year history of expansion into new territory. The Asian wine story is still in its earliest chapters. China's industry is volatile, shaped by government policy, speculation, and rapidly changing tastes. Japan's is tiny but exquisite. India's is growing fast but remains fragile. What connects them is the enduring power of wine as a cultural symbol, a drink that transcends its European origins and finds meaning in societies with entirely different food traditions, drinking customs, and ways of life. The grapevine, that most adaptable of plants, has found new soil once again. And now, let us turn to a question that millions of people have asked about their evening glass of wine. Is it actually good for you? On the evening of November the 17th, 1991, roughly 22 million American households were watching a popular TV news magazine when a segment aired that would send shockwaves through the wine industry. The reporter, standing in front of a table laden with French food, posed a question that had been puzzling health researchers for years. Why do the French, who eat a diet rich in butter, cream, cheese, and rich sauces, suffer from significantly lower rates of heart disease than Americans? The answer, according to a French researcher interviewed on the program, was wine. Moderate red wine consumption, he argued, provided a kind of protective benefit that offset the risks of eating all that fat. The reporter gave the phenomenon a name that would stick in the public imagination for decades. The impact was immediate and enormous. Within a year of the broadcast, American red wine sales jumped by roughly 40%. Wine shops reported unprecedented demand. Retailers began marketing wine almost as if it were a health food, and the wine industry, which had always been constrained by strict rules about making health claims, found itself the happy beneficiary of a public health story it had done nothing to create. The scientific story behind the claim centered on a particular compound found primarily in the skins of red grapes. Laboratory studies suggested that this compound had a remarkable range of effects, appearing to reduce inflammation, slow the growth of certain types of harmful cells, protect the heart and blood vessels, and even slow some processes associated with aging. Animal studies generated enormous excitement when mice given high doses of the compound lived longer and healthier lives than those without it. But the science turned out to be far more complicated than the TV segment suggested. The doses used in those animal studies were vastly greater than anything a human could get from drinking wine. One widely cited analysis calculated that achieving the amounts used in the research would require drinking roughly 40 liters of red wine every day, a quantity that would cause severe harm long before any benefit could appear. The amount of the beneficial compound in a single glass of wine is vanishingly small. The paradox itself turned out to be less paradoxical than it first appeared. Later research suggested that the French had lower rates of heart disease not because of wine, but because of their overall pattern of eating and living, what is now recognized as the Mediterranean approach to food, with its emphasis on fresh vegetables, fruits, olive oil, whole grains, and moderate portions. The French also traditionally ate smaller meals, spent more time at the table, and snacked less than Americans. When all of these factors were taken into account, the protective effect specifically attributed to wine became much harder to isolate. The most significant blow to the health narrative came from large-scale studies conducted in the early 21st century. A major analysis published in a leading medical journal, which examined data from nearly 600,000 people across more than 80 studies, concluded that there is no level of alcohol consumption that is entirely free of health risk. While moderate drinking might slightly reduce the chance of one type of heart problem in some people, this benefit was more than offset by increased risks of cancer, liver disease, stroke, and other conditions. The leading international health body subsequently stated that no amount of alcohol is safe from a health perspective. These findings placed the wine industry in an uncomfortable position. For years, producers had quietly benefited from the widespread belief that a glass of wine with dinner was not just harmless, but actively helpful. The TV broadcast had been an unintended marketing gift. Now the scientific consensus was shifting, and the industry faced the prospect of warning labels, advertising restrictions, and a generation of health-conscious consumers who were increasingly skeptical of the supposed benefits of their evening glass. The health debate also revealed the ways in which science can be influenced by commercial interests. Research funded by the alcohol industry is more likely to find positive health effects than research funded independently, a pattern that echoes other industries that have tried to shape the science around their products. This does not mean that all favorable research is biased, but it does suggest that claims about wine and health deserve a careful, skeptical eye. The most honest assessment is probably the most unexciting one. The effects of moderate wine drinking on health are small, complex, and highly dependent on the individual, on their genetics, their overall diet, their exercise habits, and the specific health outcomes being measured. For some people in some circumstances, a glass of wine may have modest benefits for the heart. For others, particularly those with certain risk factors, any amount of alcohol carries measurable risks. What is clear is that the relationship between wine and health has always been as much about culture and longing as about chemistry. Wine has been prescribed as medicine for thousands of years. The ancient Greek physician recommended specific wines for specific ailments. Medieval monks used wine as a disinfectant and a pain reliever. The desire to believe that something we enjoy is also good for us is a deeply human impulse, and the television broadcast tapped into that desire with extraordinary power. Perhaps the real question was never about the compound in the grape skin at all. Perhaps the real question is why we assumed that pleasure and health must always be in conflict. The cultures that have been drinking wine for thousands of years never needed a TV program to tell them that a glass with dinner was a reasonable way to live. They already knew, not because of any scientific study, but because of something quieter and older, the simple human pleasure of sharing a glass with someone you care about at the end of the day. And from the science of what is in the glass, let us turn now to its darker side, the stories of those who put something into the glass that was never supposed to be there. In 2012, investigators arrived at a modest house in a quiet suburb east of Los Angeles and found something extraordinary inside. There were thousands of wine labels, many of them painstakingly reproduced copies of labels from some of the rarest and most expensive wines in the world. There were hundreds of empty bottles, carefully cleaned and ready to be refilled. There were corks, wax seals, and foil capsules, and there were bottles of inexpensive wine being blended together in recipes designed to approximate the taste of bottles worth thousands of dollars each. The man who lived there had risen from obscurity to become one of the most prominent wine collectors in the United States. He was also, as investigators would prove, the most prolific wine forger in history. His operation was breathtaking in its boldness. He had sold millions of dollars worth of counterfeit rare wine to some of the wealthiest collectors in America. His forgeries were so skillfully made that they fooled experienced collectors, auction house experts, and even some winemakers. He blended cheap wines to mimic the flavor profiles of the legendary bottles he was counterfeiting, sourced authentic-looking packaging, and presented himself with such confidence and charm that few questioned how any single person could possibly own so many bottles of wines that barely existed in the world. The unraveling began when the head of a respected Burgundy wine estate noticed that bottles bearing his family's name and supposedly from very old years were listed for sale at auction. He knew immediately that these bottles were fakes, for the simplest of reasons. His estate had not produced that particular wine until decades after the dates on the bottles. The years listed on the forgeries literally could not exist. He flew to New York, confronted the auction house, and triggered an investigation that eventually led to an arrest, a trial, and a conviction. The forger was sentenced to 10 years in prison and ordered to pay more than $28 million. This was the most spectacular wine fraud of the modern era, but it was far from the only one. Wine fraud is as old as wine itself. The ancient Romans added a compound that happened to be sweet to their wine to improve its taste and preserve it, without realizing that it was slowly poisoning the people who drank it. Evil wine merchants routinely blended cheap wines with expensive ones. The addition of water, sugar, and various substances to wine has been practiced for as long as wine has been sold. The most shocking modern scandal before the forgery case occurred not in a counterfeiter's workshop but in the vineyards and wineries of Austria. In 1985, laboratory analysis revealed that a significant number of Austrian wines had been adulterated with a chemical compound commonly associated with antifreeze. The substance had been added to boost the apparent sweetness and richness of the wines, qualities that commanded premium prices. The discovery was almost accidental, caught during a routine check at a laboratory in Germany. The scandal devastated the Austrian wine industry. Exports collapsed virtually overnight. The country's wine became a byword for contamination and dishonesty, and it took years to rebuild the reputation. Nobody died from drinking the tainted wines because the concentrations were too low to cause immediate harm. But the psychological damage was immense. The one bright spot was that the scandal prompted Austria to enact the strictest wine laws in Europe, creating a framework that ultimately helped the country achieve a quality and reputation it had never possessed before things went so badly wrong. Another famous case involves a group of bottles that appeared in the 1980s, supposedly discovered in a hidden cellar in Paris. The bottles were engraved with initials and dates that suggested they had once belonged to one of the most famous wine lovers in American history, a president who served as minister to France in the 1780s. One bottle sold at auction for a sum that made it the most expensive bottle of wine ever purchased at that time. Years later, an investigation revealed that the initials had been carved with a modern power tool rather than the hand techniques of the 18th century, and craftsmen eventually admitted to having done the engraving. The full truth remains contested, but the case cast a long shadow over the world of rare wine collecting. The persistence of wine fraud comes down to a few simple realities that make wine uniquely vulnerable to counterfeiting. Unlike most products, wine changes with time. A bottle from one year should taste different from a bottle of the same wine from a different year, but nobody has tasted every vintage, and even the maker's memory fades over decades. Labels can be reproduced, bottles can be sourced, and the only way to truly verify what is inside a sealed bottle is to open it and drink it, at which point the evidence is gone. Modern technology has given investigators some tools for detecting fakes. Scientific dating methods can identify when a wine was made by measuring trace elements that were introduced into the atmosphere by nuclear testing in the mid-20th century or by a nuclear accident in the 1980s. Chemical analysis can reveal grape varieties, production methods, and geographic origins. But these techniques are expensive. They require opening the bottle, and they are available only to those with the resources to pay for them. The world of wine fraud is ultimately a reflection of the extraordinary value that people place on rare and ancient wine. A single bottle from a great year can sell for more than most people earn in a decade. That price reflects not just the quality of the liquid inside, but the romance, the history, and the prestige that the name represents. Where there is that much money, there will always be someone willing to fake it. And where there is fraud, there will always be the quiet, nagging question that haunts every collector who opens a bottle of something rare and old. Is this really what it says it is? And from the darker corners of the wine world, let us move now to a very different kind of rebellion, one that is taking place not in the shadows, but in the open air of the vineyard. In the hills of Beaujolais in the 1960s, a man named Jules Chauvet was doing something that his neighbors considered deeply eccentric and possibly foolish. Chauvet, who was simultaneously a wine merchant, a winemaker, and a trained chemist, was making wine without the preservative that winemakers had been adding to their wine for centuries, a substance without which, according to the wisdom of the day, wine would inevitably spoil. He was also letting the natural organisms already present in his grapes and cellar carry out the fermentation, rather than adding the laboratory-grown versions that were becoming standard practice. And he was farming his vineyards without the synthetic pesticides and fertilizers that had transformed French agriculture in the years after the war. What made Chauvet remarkable was that he was not doing this out of romantic nostalgia. He was a scientist, trained at one of the most respected research institutions in France, and he had published serious work on the chemistry of fermentation. His belief that wine could be made without modern chemical additions was based on careful experimentation, not on wishful thinking. He understood the science of winemaking at a level that few of his contemporaries could match, and he used that understanding to develop methods for producing stable, high-quality wine without the industrial shortcuts that most people considered essential. The truly revolutionary part of Chauvet's work was his influence on a group of young winemakers who gathered around him in the 1970s and 80s. The most important of these was Marcel Lapierre, a farmer in Beaujolais who began making wine without the standard preservative and without laboratory-grown fermentation agents in 1981, following Chauvet's methods closely. Lapierre, along with three close friends who shared his philosophy, became known by an affectionate nickname that suggested a small band of rebels taking on the establishment. The wines they made were unlike anything most people had tasted. They were vivid, vibrant, and alive in a way that conventional wines were not, brighter in color, more aromatic, more expressive of the specific place where they were grown. They were also, it should be said, sometimes unstable, sometimes unpredictable, and occasionally clearly flawed, a little fizzy when they should not have been, a little cloudy, with aromas that ranged from beguilingly unusual to genuinely off-putting. This unpredictability was part of the point. These wines were not manufactured products designed for consistency. Each bottle was a unique expression of a particular place, a particular season, and a particular set of tiny living organisms, each one slightly different from the next. The movement drew philosophical inspiration from a surprising source, a series of lectures given in 1924 by an Austrian thinker who laid out a holistic approach to farming that he called biodynamic agriculture. This system treated the farm as a self-contained living organism influenced by forces larger than itself, including the movements of the moon and the planets. It included a set of specific preparations made from unusual materials, things like manure fermented in a cow horn or crystals ground to a fine powder and sprayed on the vines. Biodynamic farming is, to put it very gently, controversial. The man who proposed it was not a scientist, and his agricultural ideas were based on personal insight rather than on controlled experiments. The preparations have been tested scientifically, and some studies have found no significant effect on the vines, the grapes, or the soil. And yet, many of the world's most respected winemakers practice biodynamic farming, including the estate widely considered the finest in Burgundy. The question of whether the cosmic preparations actually do anything may matter less than the intense attention to vineyard health, soil vitality, and careful observation that the biodynamic approach demands. A winemaker who is out in the vineyard burying preparations in the soil is also a winemaker who is walking the rows every day, noticing problems early and developing an intimate understanding of the land. The natural wine movement has grown from a small experiment in rural France into a global cultural force. Natural wine bars have opened in cities around the world, attracting a young urban audience drawn to the movement's spirit of rebellion, its commitment to environmental sustainability, and its celebration of imperfection and authenticity. The movement has its own festivals, its own media, and its own passionate community of believers. It has also generated fierce opposition. Critics argue that the movement romanticizes faults, that many natural wines are simply badly made wines dressed up as principled choices, and that without the standard preservatives, wines are vulnerable to spoilage, contamination, and off flavors. The arguments can get heated. Defenders of the natural approach accuse conventional producers of making industrial products stripped of soul and drenched in additives. Conventional producers accuse natural wine advocates of selling flawed products to credulous enthusiasts at inflated prices. The truth, as with most heated arguments, lies somewhere in between. The best natural wines are extraordinary, vivid, complex, and alive with flavors that conventional wines rarely achieve. The worst are genuinely unpleasant. The movement has done important work in drawing attention to the environmental costs of industrial farming, including the use of chemicals that damage soil and reduce the diversity of life in the vineyard. It has inspired a broader conversation about what wine should be, a conversation that touches on questions far larger than what goes into the bottle. Chauvet died in 1989, before the movement he inspired had spread beyond a small circle of Beaujolais farmers. Lapierre died in 2010, by which time natural wine had become a worldwide phenomenon. Their legacy is not a specific recipe or a set of rules, but a question. What is wine when you strip away everything that modern technology has added? The answer is in the glass, alive, unpredictable, sometimes beautiful, sometimes troubling, and always undeniably itself. And as this quiet rebellion was unfolding in the vineyard, a much larger force was beginning to reshape the entire map of wine. In the late summer of 2003, a wave of extreme heat settled over Western Europe, breaking temperature records that had stood for centuries and causing widespread suffering. In the vineyards of Bordeaux, grapes ripened weeks ahead of schedule, producing wines of extraordinary concentration, rich and dark and powerful. Critics praised the result as one of the great years of the modern era. But among the celebration, a quiet alarm was sounding. That year was not an unusual event. It was a preview of what was coming. The relationship between wine and climate has always been intimate and precise. Grapevines are remarkably sensitive to temperature, and the world's great wine regions have traditionally occupied a narrow band of conditions where the growing season is just warm enough and just cool enough to produce fruit of balance and character. The sparkling wine region of northeastern France is great precisely because it sits at the very edge of where grapes can ripen at all. The cool, marginal climate produces fruit of high acidity and delicate flavor, perfect for sparkling wine. The great red wine region near the Atlantic coast is great because its mild, humid climate produces a particular balance of warmth and moisture that suits its grape varieties beautifully. These relationships are not accidents. They are the product of centuries of observation and selection. Climate change is disrupting these carefully balanced relationships with a speed that has no precedent in the history of growing grapes. Average temperatures have risen by more than 1 degree since the 1980s, and the effects on wine are already plain to see. In the sparkling wine region, the average harvest date has moved forward by roughly 20 days compared to 30 years ago. Across Europe, grapes are being picked 2 to 3 weeks earlier than they were a generation ago, and the chemical makeup of the fruit is shifting in ways that alter the character of the finished wine. Warmer conditions produce riper grapes with more sugar, which means wines with higher alcohol. In many traditional regions, the alcohol in the bottle has been creeping upward for years. Wines that once measured 12.5% now routinely reach 14 or 15. Higher temperatures also reduce the acidity that gives wine its freshness and structure. Wines from traditionally cool regions are becoming softer, rounder, and less distinctive, losing the crisp, lively character that made them special. But climate change is not simply about warmer weather. It is also about greater unpredictability. Extreme events, heat waves, droughts, late frosts, hailstorms, and torrential rain are becoming more frequent and more severe. A recent year saw the lowest wine production in decades across major regions of France, devastated by late frost and disease encouraged by unusually wet conditions. These wild swings introduce a level of uncertainty that makes grape growing always a gamble, even more of one than before. The winners and losers of this shift are becoming clear. Regions that were once too cold for growing grapes are emerging as promising new wine areas. Southern England, whose chalky soils are geologically identical to those across the water in the sparkling wine heartland of France, has become one of the most exciting sparkling wine regions in the world. English sparkling wines have beaten their French counterparts in blind tastings, and at least one major French sparkling winehouse has purchased land in England as a hedge against climate change at home. Scandinavia, which would have been unthinkable as a wine region a generation ago, now has small but real commercial production in its southern reaches. In the southern hemisphere, similar shifts are underway. In Australia, producers are moving to cooler, higher altitude regions as traditional warm climate areas face ever more extreme heat. In Argentina, vineyards are being planted at elevations that would have seemed absurd not long ago, some exceeding 3,000 meters, where the cooler mountain air compensates for the warming trend at lower altitudes. The losers are the regions whose identity and reputation depend on a specific climatic balance that is being disrupted. Parts of southern Spain, southern Italy, central California, and low-lying Australia face the prospect of becoming too hot for quality grape growing. Some researchers predict that by the middle of this century, a large proportion of the world's current wine regions may become unsuitable, while entirely new areas become viable. Winemakers are adapting in a variety of ways. Some are planting different grapes, varieties that tolerate heat better, in regions that have traditionally grown cooler climate types. Others are changing the way they farm, using careful leaf management to shade the fruit from excessive sun, adjusting the spacing between vines, and picking at night to preserve freshness. In a striking acknowledgement of the changing reality, the authorities in one of France's most prestigious wine regions recently authorized the planting of several new grape varieties that had never been permitted before, including types from hotter climates. The question that climate change poses is not just practical but philosophical. The idea of terroir, the concept that wine is an expression of a specific place, depends on the assumption that the climate of that place is relatively stable. If the climate of one region becomes the climate that a neighboring region had a generation ago, does the wine retain its identity? If the conditions change so much that the traditional grapes can no longer produce the kind of wine the region is known for, what does the name on the label mean? The wine industry's response has been a mix of energetic adaptation and anxious uncertainty. Some producers are experimenting boldly with new varieties, new techniques, and entirely new locations. Others are holding fast to tradition, hoping that the trends will slow or reverse. A few are embracing the changes, arguing that warmer years produce richer, more appealing wines. But there is a growing recognition that climate change represents the most serious challenge to the world of wine since the great vine-killing epidemic of the 19th century, and that the map of wine is being redrawn whether the industry is ready or not. And before we reach the end of our journey, let us pause to consider wine's long and beautiful relationship with another kind of human creation, the art and literature that has celebrated it for thousands of years. On the wall of a small dining room in a buried Roman villa in Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash for nearly 2,000 years, a painting shows a group of figures reclining on couches, drinking wine from shallow cups, their faces warm with pleasure. The painting is one of hundreds of wine-related artworks recovered from the ruins, cities frozen in time by the eruption of a volcano in 79 of the Common Era. These images document something more than the drinking habits of the ancient Romans. They show us how central wine has been to the human experience of pleasure, community, and togetherness for as long as we have been making pictures on walls. The tradition of depicting wine in art begins in the ancient world and has never stopped. Greek painters of the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era created thousands of images of the god of wine, surrounded by joyful followers in scenes of ecstatic celebration. The large bowls in which the Greeks mixed their wine with water at social gatherings were themselves canvases for some of the finest painting of the ancient world, and many of these vessels showed the very act of drinking that they were made to accompany. Wine and art were not merely connected in ancient Greece. They were woven together, each one inspiring and enriching the other. In the Christian tradition, wine took on a completely different meaning. One of the most famous paintings in the history of art, created in the late 1400s on the wall of a dining hall in Milan, shows the moment when wine was transformed from a worldly pleasure into a sacred symbol. The cup on the table represents a new bond between the divine and the human, and this single image changed the way an entire civilization thought about wine. For centuries afterward, the cup of wine in European art carried this double meaning, a reminder of earthly joy and a symbol of something much deeper. The painters of the Netherlands in the 1600s made wine one of their favorite subjects. In their meticulously detailed still life paintings, wine glasses, decanters, and bottles served several purposes at once. They showed off the artist's skill at capturing light passing through glass and liquid. They signaled the wealth and taste of the person who paid for the painting, and they carried a quiet moral message. In a particular type of still life, symbols of pleasure, a glass of wine, a plate of food, a vase of flowers were placed beside reminders of death, a skull, a burned-out candle, a piece of fruit beginning to decay. The message was gentle but unmistakable. Enjoy what you have, these paintings whisper, for it will not last. In literature, wine has been a companion to writers across every culture and every age. The ancient Hebrew scriptures use wine as an image of love, of joy, of divine generosity. The great Persian poets, whose wine verses we explored earlier in our journey, used wine as a symbol of spiritual longing and the overwhelming experience of being close to the divine. Their wine poetry stands as one of the great achievements of world literature, a tradition in which the act of drinking becomes something far larger than itself. In European writing, wine appears everywhere as a marker of civilization, of social class, of character. One of the greatest comic creations in English literature is a portly, boastful knight who drinks his beloved sherry in vast quantities and celebrates it in speeches so joyful that the act of drinking sounds like a philosophy of life. A French poet of the 19th century wrote about wine with a mixture of celebration and despair, depicting it as both a companion in loneliness and an escape from the misery of the modern city. An American novelist who lived among the vineyards and cafes of France and Spain wove wine into nearly everything he wrote, using it as a mark of authenticity and a symbol of the good life lived on one's own terms. The 20th century brought wine to the cinema, and film proved to be a medium uniquely suited to exploring the emotional and cultural dimensions of drinking. The most consequential wine film ever made was a comedy released in 2004 about two friends on a road trip through a wine-growing valley in California. Its impact on the market was measured by a university study and given its own name. Sales of one red grape variety dropped sharply after the film's main character declared his refusal to drink it, while sales of his preferred variety increased by roughly 16% over the following years. No wine critic, no marketing campaign, no trade agreement had ever shifted consumer behavior as effectively as a single line of dialogue in a movie. Other films explored the world of wine from different angles. One dramatized the famous 1976 tasting that changed everything. A documentary examined the tensions between tradition and globalization in the industry, asking uncomfortable questions about the forces that were reshaping wine around the world. A Japanese animated series depicted wine tasting with such intensity and sensory richness that it became a cultural phenomenon in Asia and helped fuel the growth of wine culture in Japan and South Korea. Wine's power as a symbol extends far beyond any individual work of art. It belongs to a very small group of substances alongside bread, salt, and water that carry deep meaning across nearly every human culture. Wine represents celebration, communion, wisdom, temptation, and the passage of time. It is a symbol of luxury and of simplicity, of divine blessing and of human excess, of the joy of the present and the memory of the past. This richness of meaning is what makes wine such a fertile subject for the human imagination. A glass of wine in a painting or a poem or a film is never just a glass of wine. It is always also a statement about what it means to be alive, about pleasure and loss, about community and solitude, about the mysterious transformation of nature into culture that happens every time grapes are crushed, fermented, and poured into a waiting glass. And now, as our long journey through the history of wine nears its end, let us look ahead toward the glass that has not yet been poured. In a laboratory in San Francisco, a team of scientists is doing something that would horrify every winemaker who has ever tended a vine or nursed a barrel through fermentation. They are trying to make wine without grapes. Using advanced chemistry and data analysis, they are attempting to identify the hundreds of compounds that give wine its aroma, flavor, and texture, and recreate them from other sources entirely. Whether or not this experiment ever produces something that people actually want to drink, the very fact that it is being attempted tells you something about the forces that are converging on the world of wine as we move deeper into the 21st century. Climate change, shifting tastes, new technologies, and changing attitudes toward alcohol are all reshaping an industry that has been fundamentally the same for thousands of years. The question is not whether wine will survive. It almost certainly will. The question is what wine will look like in 50 or 100 years. The most immediate challenge is generational. In most of wine's traditional markets, consumption is declining, driven primarily by the habits of younger people. The generation born in the late 1990s and early 2000s drinks significantly less alcohol than any generation that came before. Surveys consistently show that these younger consumers place a high value on wellness, moderation, and mindful living, and many choose not to drink alcohol at all. In one major market, a recent survey found that fewer than 3 in 10 regular wine drinkers were under 40, while nearly half were over 55. The industry is watching these numbers with concern. The response has been creative. Low alcohol and alcohol-free wines are among the fastest growing segments of the entire beverage market. Wines in cans, in pouches, and in single-serving bottles are attracting younger buyers who find the traditional full-sized bottle inconvenient or wasteful. Wine-based cocktails and spritzes have introduced wine to people who might never have ordered a glass on its own. Technology is transforming every step of the process from the vineyard to the glass. Small flying machines equipped with special cameras can now survey a vineyard from above, detecting stress, disease, and nutrient problems in the vines before they become visible to the human eye, allowing targeted treatment that can reduce the use of chemicals by a third or more. In the winery, machines can sort individual grapes as they arrive, rejecting damaged or unripe fruit with a precision no human hand can match. Temperature-controlled tanks allow winemakers to manage fermentation with scientific exactness. And yet, this technological future exists in tension with wine's deep attachment to tradition. For many producers, particularly in the old wine regions of Europe, the appeal of wine lies precisely in its resistance to being standardized, in the idea that each bottle is an expression of a specific place and a particular year, shaped by human judgment rather than by algorithms. The natural wine movement, with its rejection of modern intervention and its celebration of imperfection, represents a powerful alternative vision, one that insists the soul of wine lives in its wildness, not in its optimization. Sustainability has become a central concern. Younger consumers care deeply about how their food and drink is produced, and the wine industry has a significant footprint. Growing grapes requires water and land. Making glass bottles requires energy. Shipping wine around the world generates emissions. Producers are responding with lighter bottles, alternative packaging, solar-powered wineries, organic farming, and careful water management. The geography of wine continues to expand. Wine is being made in countries that would have seemed impossible a generation ago, in England, Belgium, Sweden, and even Norway. In Asia, China, Japan, India, and Thailand are building wine industries that reflect their own cultures and cuisines. In Africa, countries beyond South Africa are beginning to explore the possibilities of the grape. The vine's 8,000-year migration shows no sign of stopping. And so, as we come to the end of our journey, let us take a moment to look back at how far we have traveled together. We began in the mountains of the Caucasus, where someone, perhaps 8,000 years ago, tasted the juice of wild grapes that had been sitting in a clay jar and discovered, by pure accident, the miracle of fermentation. We followed the vine to the buried clay vessels of Georgia and Armenia, and from there to the banks of the Nile, where pharaohs stored wine in their tombs for the afterlife. We sailed with the Phoenician traders who carried vine cuttings across the Mediterranean, and we drank with the Greeks at their evening gatherings where wine and philosophy flowed together. We walked with the Roman legions who carried viticulture to Gaul and the Rhine, and we knelt with the monks of Burgundy who spent centuries mapping the soul of the soil. We crossed the English Channel with barrels of claret, and we traveled the sun-baked roads of Spain, Italy, Hungary, and Portugal, where an entire mosaic of wine traditions took shape. We listened to the story of sparkling wine, born not from a single flash of genius, but from centuries of patient discovery. We crossed the ocean with missionaries and settlers who carried vine cuttings to the Americas, to the southern tip of Africa, to Australia. We looked through Pasteur's microscope and saw, for the first time, the tiny living things that make wine possible. We watched in quiet horror as a nearly invisible insect destroyed every vineyard in Europe, and we marveled at the counterintuitive solution that saved them: European grapes grafted onto American roots. We sat through the dark years of Prohibition and the darker years of war. We were in the room in Paris when California wines beat the legends of France. We felt the power of a single critic's score. We examined the cork, the barrel, and the bottle. We argued about terroir and the laws that protect it. We remembered the women whose contributions were overlooked for far too long, and we followed the vine to the southern hemisphere and to the unexpected vineyards of Asia. We asked whether wine is good for us, and the answer, as answers often are, was complicated. We uncovered fraud and forgery, and we met the rebels who believed that the best wine is the one that nature makes on its own. We watched the map of wine being redrawn by a changing climate, and we saw wine reflected in the paintings, poems, and films that human beings have been making for as long as they have been making wine. What a journey it has been! 8,000 years of human ingenuity, of patient observation, of happy accidents and devastating setbacks, of the simple, enduring desire to turn the fruit of the vine into something that brings people together. The future will bring changes that we cannot yet imagine, but the vine will still be there, rooted in the earth, reaching toward the sun, offering its fruit to whoever is willing to tend it with care. And somewhere, at the end of a long day, someone will pour a glass, and the ancient partnership between the grape and the human hand will continue, just as it has since the very beginning. So rest now if you are ready. Let the story settle around you like a warm blanket. Close your eyes and know that the world is full of quiet, beautiful things made slowly with patience by people who cared. Good night and sleep well.